Chapter 17 The Second Cataract Part 1 A fresh breeze, a full sail, and the consciousness of a holiday well earned carried us gaily along from Abu Simbel to Wadi Halfa. We started late in the afternoon of the first day, made about 12 miles before the wind dropped, and achieved the remaining 28 miles before noon the next day. It was our last trip on the Nile under canvas. At Wadi Halfa the Philae was doomed to be dismantled. The big sail that had so long been our pride and delight would there be taken down, and our good boat, her grace and swiftness gone at one fell swoop, would become a mere lumbering barge, more suggestive of civic outings on the Thames than of Cleopatra's galley. For some way beyond Abu Simbel the western bank is fringed by a long line of volcanic mountains, as much alike in height, size, and shape as a row of Martello towers. They are divided from one another by a series of perfectly uniform sand drifts, while on the rounded top of each mountain, thick as the currants on the top of a certain cake known to schoolboys by the endearing name of black caps, lies a layer of the oddest black stones in the world. Having more than once been to the top of the rock of Abshek, which is the first large mountain of the chain, and strewn in the same way, we recognized the stones, and knew what they were like. In colour they are purplish-black, tinged here and there with dull red. They ring like clinkstone when struck, and in shape are most fantastic. L. picked up some like petrified bunches of grapes. Others are twisted and writhen like the Vesuvian lava of 1871. They lie loose upon the surface, and are of all sizes, some being as small as currants, and others as large as quartern loaves. Speaking as one having no kind of authority, I should say that these stones are unquestionably of fiery parentage. One seems to see how, boiling and bubbling in a state of fusion, they must have been suddenly checked by contact with some cooler medium. Where the chain ends, about 3 or 4 miles above Abu Simbel, the view widens, and a host of outlying mountains are seen scattered over an immense plain reaching for miles into the western desert. On the eastern bank, Khalat Ada, a huge, rambling Roman citadel going to solitary ruin on the last water-washed precipice to the left, brings the opposite range to a like end, and abuts on a similar plain, also scattered over with detached peaks. The scene here is desolately magnificent. A large island covered with palms divides the Nile in 2 branches, each of which looks as wide as the whole river. An unbounded distance opens away to the silvery horizon. On the banks there is no verdure, neither is there any sign of human toil. Nothing lives, nothing moves, save the wind and the river. Of all the strange peaks we have yet seen, the mountains hereabout are the strangest. Alone or in groups, they start up here and there from the deserts on both sides, like the pieces on a chessboard. They are, for the most part, conical, but they are not extinct craters, such as are the volcanic cones of Korosko and Dhaka. Seeing how they all rose to about the same height, and were alike capped with that mysterious couche of shining black stones, the writer could not help fancying that, like the isolated Rocher de Corneille and Rocher de Saint Michel at Puy, they might be but fragments of a rocky crust, rent and swept away at some indefinitely remote period of the world's history, and that the level of their present summits might represent perhaps the ancient level of the plain. As regards form, they are weird enough for the wildest geological theories. All taper more or less towards the top. One is 4-sided like a pyramid, another, in shape like a truncated cone, looks as if crowned with a pagoda summer-house. A third seems to be surrounded by a mosque and cupola, a fourth is scooped out in tiers of arches, a fifth is crowned apparently with a cairn of piled stones, and so on with variations as endless as they are fantastic. A geologist might perhaps account for these caprices by showing how fire and earthquake and deluge had here succeeded each other, and how, after being first covered with volcanic stones and then split into chasms, the valleys thus opened had, by and by, been traversed by torrents, which wore away the softer parts of the rock and left the harder standing. Some way beyond Khalat Ada, when the Abu Simbel range and the Palm Island have all but vanished in the distance, and the lonely peak, called the Mountain of the Sun, Gebel esh Shems, has been left far behind, we come upon a new wonder, namely, upon 2 groups of scattered tumuli, one on the eastern, one on the western bank. Not volcanic forms these, not even accidental forms, if one may venture to form an opinion from so far off. They are of various size, some little, some big, all perfectly round and smooth, and covered with a rich greenish-brown alluvial soil. How did they come here? Who made them? What did they contain? The Roman ruin close by, the 240,000 deserters who must have passed this way, the Egyptian and Ethiopian armies that certainly poured their thousands along these very banks, and might have fought many a battle on this open plain, suggest all kinds of possibilities, and fill one's head with visions of buried arms, and jewels, and cinerary urns. We are more than half-minded to stop the boat and land that very moment, but are content on second thoughts with promising ourselves that we will at least excavate one of the smaller hillocks on our way back. And now, the breeze freshening and the dahabeah tearing gallantly along, we leave the tumuli behind and enter upon a still more desolate region, where the mountains recede farther than ever and the course of the river is interrupted by perpetual sandbanks. On one of these sandbanks, just a few yards above the edge of the water, lay a log of driftwood, apparently a battered old palm trunk, with some remnants of broken branches yet clinging to it. Such an object, in short, as my American friends would very properly call a snag. Our pilot leaned forward on the tiller, put his finger to his lip, and whispered, "Crocodilo." The painter, the idle man, the writer, were all on deck, and not one believed him. They had seen too many of these snags already, and were not going to let themselves again be excited about nothing. The pilot pointed to the cabin where Elle and the little lady were indulging in that minor vice called afternoon tea. "Sitte," said he. "Call sitte. Crocodilo." We examined the object through our glasses. We laughed the pilot to scorn. It was the worst imitation of a crocodile that we had yet seen. All at once the palm trunk lifted up its head, cocked its tail, found its legs, set off running, wriggling, undulating down the slope with incredible rapidity, and was gone before we could utter an exclamation. We three had a bad time when the other two came up and found that we had seen our first crocodile without them. A sandbank which we passed next morning was scored all over with fresh trails, and looked as if it had been the scene of a crocodile parliament. There must have been at least 20 or 30 members present at the sitting, and the freshness of the marks showed that they had only just dispersed. A keen and cutting wind carried us along the last 30 miles of our journey. We had supposed that the farther south we penetrated, the hotter we should find the climate. Yet now, strange to say, we were shivering in sealskins under the most brilliant sky in the world, and in a latitude more southerly than that of Mecca or Calcutta. It was some compensation, however, to run at full speed past the dullest of Nile scenery, seeing only sandbanks in the river, sand hills and sand flats on either hand, a disused shadoof or a skeleton boat rotting at the water's edge, a wind-tormented dome palm struggling for existence on the brink of the bank. Chapter 17. The Second Cataract, Part 2. At a fatal corner about 6 miles below Wadi Halfa we passed a melancholy flotilla of dismantled dahabeahs. The Fostet, the Zenobia, the Alice, the Mansura, all alike weather-bound and laid up helplessly against the wind. The Mansura, with Captain and Mrs. E. on board, had been 3 days doing these 6 miles, at which rate of progress they might reasonably hope to reach Cairo in about a year and a month. The palms of Wadi Halfa, blue with distance, came into sight at the next bend, and by noon the Philae was once more moored alongside the Bagstones under a shore crowded with cangias, covered with bales and packing cases, and, like the shores of Mahada and Aswan, populous with temporary huts. For here it is that traders going by water embark and disembark on their way to and fro Dongola and the First Cataract. There were 3 temples, or at all events 3 ancient Egyptian buildings, once upon a time on the western bank over against Wadi Halfa. Now there are a few broken pillars, a solitary fragment of brick pylon, some remains of a flight of stone steps leading down to the river, and a wall of enclosure overgrown with wild pumpkins. These ruins, together with a rambling native khan and a noble old sycamore, form a picturesque group backed by amber sand cliffs, and mark the site of a lost city belonging to the early days of Usertesen III. The second, or Great Cataract, begins a little way above Wadi Halfa and extends over a distance of many miles. It consists, like the first cataract, of a succession of rocks and rapids, and is skirted for the first 5 miles or so by the sand cliff ridge which, as I have said, forms a background to the ruins just opposite Wadi Halfa. This ridge terminates abruptly in the famous precipice known as the Rock of Abu Sir. Only adventurous travellers bound for Dongola or Khartoum go beyond this point, and they, for the most part, take the shorter route across the desert from Carrasco. L. and the writer would fain have hired camels and pushed on as far as Semna, which is a matter of only 2 days' journey from Wadi Halfa, and for people provided with sketching tents is one of the easiest of inland excursions. One may go to the Rock of Abu Sir by land or by water. The happy couple and the writer took 2 native boatmen versed in the intricacies of the cataract, and went in the felucca. L. and the painter preferred donkeying. Given a good breeze from the right quarter, there is, as regards time, but little to choose between the 2 routes. No one, however, who has approached the Rock of Abu Sir by water, and seen it rise like a cathedral front from the midst of that labyrinth of rocky islets, some like clusters of basaltic columns, some crowned with crumbling ruins, some bleak and bare, some green with wild pomegranate trees, can doubt which is the more picturesque. Landing among the tamarisks at the foot of the cliff, we come to the spreading skirts of a sand-drift steeper and more fatiguing to climb than the sand-drift at Abu Simbel. We do climb it, however, though somewhat sulkily, and finding the donkey party perched upon the top, are comforted with draughts of ice-cold lemonade brought in a kulla from Wadi Halfa. The summit of the rock is a mere ridge, steep and overhanging towards east and south, and carved all over with autographs in stone. Some few of these are interesting, but for the most part they record only the visits of the illustrious obscure. We found Belzoni's name, but looked in vain for the signatures of Burckhardt, Champollion, Lepsius, and Ampere. Owing to the nature of the ground and the singular clearness of the atmosphere, the view from this point seemed to me to be the most extensive I had ever looked upon. Yet the height of the Rock of Abu Sir is comparatively insignificant. It would count but as a molehill if measured against some alpine summits of my acquaintance. I doubt whether it is as lofty as even the Great Pyramid. It is, however, a giddy place to look down from, and seems higher than it is. It is hard, now that we are actually here, to realize that this is the end of our journey. The cataract, an immense multitude of black and shining islets, among which the river, divided into hundreds of separate channels, spreads far and wide for a distance, it is said, of more than 16 miles, foams at our feet. Foams and frets and falls, gushing smooth and strong where its course is free, murmuring hoarsely where it is interrupted, now hurrying, now loitering, here eddying in oily circles, there lying in still pools unbroken by a ripple, everywhere full of life, full of voices, everywhere shining to the sun. Northwards, where it winds away towards Abu Simbel, we see all the fantastic mountains of yesterday on the horizon. To the east, still bounded by outliers of the same disconnected chain, lies a rolling waste of dark and stony wilderness, trenched with innumerable valleys through which flow streams of sand. On the western side, the continuity of the view is interrupted by the ridge which ends with Abu Sir. Southwards, the Libyan desert reaches away in one vast, undulating plain, tawny, arid, monotonous, all sun, all sand, lit here and there with arrowy flashes of the Nile. Farthest of all, pale but distinct, on the outermost rim of the world, rise 2 mountain summits, one long, one dome-like. Our Nubians tell us that these are the mountains of Dongola. Comparing our position with that of the Third Cataract, as it appears upon the map, we come to the conclusion that these ghost-like silhouettes are the summits of Mount Fogo and Mount Arambo, 2 apparently parallel mountains situate on opposite sides of the river about 10 miles below Hannek, and consequently about 145 miles as the bird flies from the spot on which we are standing. In all this extraordinary panorama, so wild, so weird, so desolate, there is nothing really beautiful except the color. But the color is transcendent. Never, even in Egypt, have I seen anything so tender, so transparent, so harmonious. I shut my eyes, and it all comes before me. I see the amber of the sands, the pink and pearly mountains, the cataract rocks, all black and purple and polished, the dull grey palms that cluster here and there upon the larger islands, the vivid verdure of the tamarisks and pomegranates, the Nile a greenish-brown flecked with yeasty foam, over all the blue and burning sky, permeated with light and palpitating with sunshine. I made no sketch. I felt that it would be ludicrous to attempt it. And now I feel that any endeavour to put the scene into words is a mere presumptuous effort to describe the indescribable. Words are useful instruments, but, like the etching needle and the burin, they stop short at form. They cannot translate colour. If a traveller pressed for time asked me whether he should or should not go as far as the Second Cataract, I think I should recommend him to turn back from Abu Simbel. The trip must cost 4 days, and if the wind should happen to be unfavourable either way, it may cost 6 or 7. The 40 miles of river that have to be twice traversed are the dullest on the Nile. The cataract is but an enlarged and barren edition of the cataract between Aswan and Philae, and the Great View, as I have said, has not that kind of beauty which attracts the general tourist. It has an interest, however, beyond and apart from that of beauty. It rouses one's imagination to a sense of the greatness of the Nile. We look across a world of desert, and see the river still coming from afar. We have reached a point at which all that is habitable and familiar comes abruptly to an end. Not a village, not a bean field, not a shadoof, not a sakia is to be seen in the plain below. There is no sail on those dangerous waters. There is no moving creature on those pathless sands. But for the telegraphic wires stalking ghost-like across the desert, it would seem as if we had touched the limit of civilization, and were standing on the threshold of a land unexplored. Yet for all this we feel as if we were at only the beginning of the mighty river. We have journeyed well nigh 1,000 miles against the stream, but what is that to the distance which still lies between us and the Great Lakes? And how far beyond the Great Lakes must we seek for the source that is even yet undiscovered? Chapter 17. The Second Cataract, Part 3. We stayed at Wadi Halfa but one night, and paid but one visit to the cataract. We saw no crocodiles, though they are still plentiful among those rocky islets. The M.B.'s, who had been here a week, were full of crocodile stories, and of Alfred's deeds of arms. He had stalked and shot a monster 2 days before our arrival, but the creature had rushed into the water when hit, waving its tail furiously above its head, and had neither been seen nor heard of since. Like Achilles, the crocodile has but one vulnerable spot, and this is a small unarmoured patch behind the forearm. He will take a good deal of killing even there, unless the bullet finds its way to a vital part, or is of the diabolical kind called explosive. Even when mortally wounded, he seldom drops on the spot. With his last strength he rushes to the water and dies at the bottom. After 3 days the carcass rises and floats, and our friends were now waiting in order that Alfred might bag his big game. Too often, however, the poor brute either crawls into a hole, or in his agony becomes entangled among weeds and comes up no more. For one crocodile bagged, a dozen regain the river, and after lingering miserably under water, die out of sight and out of reach of the sportsman. While we were climbing the rock of Abu Sir, our men were busy taking down the big sail and preparing the Philae for her long and ignominious journey downstream. We came back to find the mainyard laid along like a roof tree above our heads, the sail rolled up in a huge ball and resting on the roof of the kitchen, the small aftersail and yard hoisted on the mainmast, the oars lashed 6 on each side, and the lower deck a series of yawning chasms, every alternate plank being taken up so as to form seats and standing places for the rowers. Thus dismantled, the dahabeah becomes, in fact, a galley. Her oars are now her chief motive power, and a crew of steady rowers, having always the current to their favour, can do 30 miles a day. When, however, a good breeze blows from the south, the small sail and the current are enough to carry the boat well along, and then the men reserve their strength for rowing by night, when the wind has dropped. Sometimes, when it is a dead calm and the rowers need rest, the dahabeah is left to her own devices, and floats with the stream, now waltzing ludicrously in the middle of the river, now drifting sidewise like Mr. Winkle's horse, now sidling up to the east bank, now changing her mind and blundering over to the west, making upon average about 1.5 miles or 2 miles an hour, and presenting a pitiful spectacle of helpless imbecility. At other times, however, the head-wind blows so hard that neither oars nor current avail, and then there is nothing for it but to lie under the bank and wait for better times. This was our sad case in going back to Abu Simbel. Having struggled with no little difficulty through the first 25 miles, we came to a deadlock about halfway between Faras and Gabel es Shems. Carried forward by the stream, driven back by the wind, buffeted by the waves, and bumped incessantly by the rocking to and fro of the felucca, our luckless Philae, after oscillating for hours within the space of a mile, was run at last into a sheltered nook, and there left in peace till the wind should change or drop. Imprisoned here for a day and a half, we found ourselves, fortunately, within reach of the tumuli which we had already made up our minds to explore. Making first for those on the east bank, we took with us in the felucca 4 men to row and dig, a fire shovel, a small hatchet, an iron bar, and a large wicker basket, which were the only implements we possessed. What we wanted both then and afterwards, and what no dahabeah should ever be without, were 2 or 3 good spades, a couple of picks, and a crowbar. Climbing to the top of one of the highest of these hillocks, we began by surveying the ground. The desert here is firm to the tread, flat, compact, and thickly strewn with pebbles. Of the fine yellow sand which characterizes the Libyan bank, there is little to be seen, and that little lies like snow in drifts and clefts and hollows, as if carried thither by the wind. The tumuli, however, are mounded of pure alluvial mould, smooth, solid, and symmetrical. We counted 34 of all sizes, from 5 to about 35 feet in height, and saw at least as many more on the opposite side of the river. Selecting one of about 8 feet high, we then set the sailors to work, and although it was impossible, with so few men and such insufficient tools, to cut straight through the centre of the mound, we at all events succeeded in digging down to a solid substratum of lumps of crude clay, evidently moulded by hand. Whether these formed only the foundation of the tumulus, or concealed a grave excavated below the level of the desert, we had neither time nor means to ascertain. It was something, at all events, to have convinced ourselves that the mounds were artificial. As we came away, we met a Nubian peasant trudging northwards. He was leading a sorry camel, had a white cockerel under his arm, and was followed by a frightened woman, who drew her shawl over her face and cowered behind him at the sight of the Inglese. We asked the men what the mounds were, and who made them, but he shook his head and said they had been there from old time. We then inquired by what name they were known in these parts, to which, urging his camel forward, he replied hesitatingly that they had a name, but he had forgotten it. Having gone a little way, however, he presently turned back, saying that he now remembered all about it, and that they were called the horns of Yakma. More than this we could not get from him. Who Yakma was, or how he came to have horns, or why his horns should take the form of tumuli, was more than he could tell or we could guess. We gave him a small bakshish, however, in return for this mysterious piece of information, and went our way with all possible speed, intending to row across and see the mounds on the opposite bank before sunset. But we had not calculated upon the difficulty of either threading our way among a chain of sandbanks, or going at least 2 miles farther north, so as to get round into the navigable channel at the other side. We of course tried the shorter way, and after running aground some 3 or 4 times, had to give it up, hoist our little sail, and scud homewards as fast as the wind would carry us. Coming back thus, after an excursion in the felucca, is one of the many pleasant things that one has to remember of the Nile. The sun has set, the afterglow has faded, the stars are coming out. Leaning back with a satisfied sense of something seen or done, one listens to the old dreamy chant of the rowers, and to the ripple under the keel. The palms, meanwhile, glide past, and are seen in bronzed relief against the sky. Presently the big boat, all glittering with lights, looms up out of the dusk. A cheery voice hails from the poop. We glide under the bows. Half a dozen smiling brown faces bid us welcome, and as many pairs of brown hands are outstretched to help us up the side. A savory smell is wafted from the kitchen. A pleasant vision of the dining saloon, with table ready spread and lamps ready lit, flashes upon us through the open doorway. We are at home once more. Let us eat, drink, rest, and be merry, for tomorrow the hard work of sightseeing and sketching begins again. Chapter 18. Discoveries at Abu Simbel, Part 1. We came back to find a fleet of dahabeahs ranged along the shore at Abu Simbel, and no less than 3 sketching tents in occupation of the ground. One of these, which happened to be pitched on the precise spot vacated by our painter, was courteously shifted to make way for the original tenant, and in the course of a couple of hours we were all as much at home as if we had not been away for half a day. Here, meanwhile, was our old acquaintance the Fawcett, with her party of gentlemen, yonder the Zenobia, all ladies, the little Alice with Sir J.C. and Mr. W. on board, the Serena flying the stars and stripes, the Mansoura bound presently for the Fayoum. To these were next day added the Ebers with a couple of German savants, and the Bagstones, welcome back from Wadi Halfa. What with arrivals and departures, exchange of visits, exhibitions of sketches, and sociabilities of various kinds, we now had quite a gay time. The Philae gave a dinner party in fantasia under the very noses of the Colossi, and every evening there was drumming and howling enough among the assembled crews to raise the ghosts of Rameses and all his queens. This was pleasant enough while it lasted, but when the strangers dropped off one by one, and at the end of 3 days we were once more alone, I think we were not sorry. The place, somehow, was too solemn for singing, laughing, ogling, and all that. It was by comparing our watches with those of the travellers whom we met at Abu Simbel that we now found out how hopelessly our timekeepers and theirs had gone astray. We had been altering ours continually ever since leaving Cairo, but the sun was as continually putting them wrong again, so that we had lost all count of the true time. The first words with which we now greeted a newcomer was, "Do you know what o'clock it is?" To which the stranger as invariably replied that it was the very question he himself was about to ask. The confusion became at last so great that, finding we had about 11 hours of day to 13 of night, we decided to establish an arbitrary canon, so we called it 7 when the sun rose, and 6 when it set, which answered every purpose. It was between 2 and 4 o'clock, according to this time of ours, that the Southern Cross was now visible every morning. It is undoubtedly best seen at Abu Simbel. The river here is very wide, and just where the constellation rises there is an opening in the mountains on the eastern bank, so that these 4 fine stars, though still low in the heavens, are seen in a free space of sky. If they make even so a less magnificent appearance than one has been led to expect, it is probably because we see them from too low a point of view. To say that a constellation is foreshortened sounds absurd, yet that is just what is the matter with the Southern Cross at Abu Simbel. Viewed at an angle of about 30 degrees, it necessarily looks distort and dim. If seen burning in the zenith, it would no doubt come up to the level of its reputation. It was now the 5th day of our return from Wadi Halfa, when an event occurred that roused us to an unwonted pitch of excitement, and kept us at high pressure throughout the rest of our time. The day was Sunday, the date February 16th, 1874, the time, according to Philae reckoning, about 11 a.m., when the painter, enjoying his 7th day's holiday after his own fashion, went strolling about among the rocks. He happened to turn his steps southwards, and passing the front of the great temple, climbed to the top of a little shapeless mound of fallen cliff, and sand, and crude brick wall, just against the corner where the mountain slopes down to the river. Immediately round this corner, looking almost due south, and approachable by only a narrow ledge of rock, are 2 votive tablets sculptured and painted, both of the 38th year of Rameses II. We had seen these from the river as we came back from Wadi Halfa, and had remarked how fine the view must be from that point. Beyond the fact that they are coloured, and that the colour upon them is still bright, there is nothing remarkable about these inscriptions. There are many such at Abu Simbel. Our painter did not, therefore, come here to examine the tablets. He was attracted solely by the view. Turning back presently, his attention was arrested by some much mutilated sculptures on the face of the rock, a few yards nearer the south buttress of the temple. He had seen these sculptures before, so indeed had I when wandering about that first day in search of a point of view, without especially remarking them. The relief was low, the execution slight, and the surface so broken away that only a few confused outlines remained. The thing that now caught the painter's eye, however, was a long crack running transversely down the face of the rock. It was such a crack as might have been caused, one would say, by blasting. He stooped, cleared the sand away a little with his hand, observed that the crack widened, poked in the point of his stick, and found that it penetrated to a depth of 2 or 3 feet. Even then it seemed to him to stop, not because it encountered any obstacle, but because the crack was not wide enough to admit the thick end of the stick. This surprised him. No mere fault in the natural rock, he thought, would go so deep. He scooped away a little more sand, and still the cleft widened. He introduced the stick a second time. It was a long palm stick like an alpenstock, and it measured about 5 feet in length. When he probed the cleft with it this second time, it went in freely up to where he held it in his hand. That is to say, to a depth of quite 4 feet. Convinced now that there was some hidden cavity in the rock, he carefully examined the surface. There were yet visible a few hieroglyphic characters and part of 2 cartouches, as well as some battered outlines of what had once been figures. The heads of these figures were gone, the face of the rock, with whatever may have been sculptured upon it, having come away bodily at this point, while from the waist downwards they were hidden under the sand. Only some hands and arms, in short, could be made out. They were the hands and arms apparently of 4 figures, 2 in the centre of the composition and 2 at the extremities. The 2 centre ones, which seemed to be back to back, probably represented gods, the outer ones worshippers. All at once it flashed upon the painter that he had seen this kind of group many a time before, and generally over a doorway. Feeling sure now that he was on the brink of a discovery, he came back, fetched away Salome and Mehemet Ali, and without saying a syllable to anyone, set to work with these 2 to scrape away the sand at the spot where the crack widened. Meanwhile, the luncheon bell having rung thrice, we concluded that the painter had rambled off somewhere into the desert, and so sat down without him. Towards the close of the meal, however, came a penciled note, the contents of which ran as follows: "Pray come immediately. I have found the entrance to a tomb. Please send some sandwiches. A.M.C." To follow the messenger at once to the scene of action was the general impulse. In less than 10 minutes we were there, asking breathless questions, peeping in through the fast-widening aperture, and helping to clear away the sand. All that Sunday afternoon, heedless of possible sunstroke, unconscious of fatigue, we toiled upon our hands and knees, as for bare life, under the burning sun. We had the crew up, working like tigers. Every one helped, even the dragoman and the 2 maids. More than once, when we paused for a moment's breathing space, we said to each other, "If those at home could see us, what would they say?" And now, more than ever, we felt the need of implements. With a spade or 2 and a wheelbarrow we could have done wonders, but with only 1 small fire shovel, a birch broom, a couple of charcoal baskets, and about 20 pairs of hands, we were poor indeed. What was wanted in means, however, was made up in method. Some scraped away the sand, some gathered it into baskets, some carried the baskets to the edge of the cliff and emptied them into the river. The idle man distinguished himself by scooping out a channel where the slope was steepest, which greatly facilitated the work. Emptied down this chute and kept continually going, the sand poured off in a steady stream like water. Meanwhile the opening grew rapidly larger. When we first came up, that is, when the painter and the 2 sailors had been working on it for about an hour, we found a hole scarcely as large as one's hand, through which it was just possible to catch a dim glimpse of painted walls within. By sunset the top of the doorway was laid bare, and where the crack ended in a large triangular fracture, there was an aperture about 1.5 feet square, into which Mehemet Ali was the first to squeeze his way. We passed him in a candle and a box of matches, but he came out again directly, saying that it was a most beautiful berba, and quite light within. The writer wiggled in next. She found herself looking down from the top of a sand slope into a small square chamber. This sand drift, which here rose to within 1.5 feet of the top of the doorway, was heaped to the ceiling in the corner behind the door. There was light enough to see every detail distinctly, the painted frieze running round just under the ceiling, the bas-relief sculptures on the walls, gorgeous with unfaded colour, the smooth sand pitted near the top where Muhammad Ali had trodden, but undisturbed elsewhere by human foot, the great gap in the middle of the ceiling where the rock had given way, the fallen fragments on the floor now almost buried in sand. Satisfied that the place was absolutely fresh and untouched, the writer crawled out, and the others one by one crawled in. When each had seen it in turn, the opening was barricaded for the night, the sailors being forbidden to enter it, lest they should injure the decorations. That evening was held a solemn council, whereat it was decided that Ptolemy and Rais Hassan should go tomorrow to the nearest village, there to engage the services of 50 able-bodied natives. With such help we calculated that the place might easily be cleared in 2 days. If it was a tomb, we hoped to discover the entrance to the mummy pit below. If but a small chapel or speos like those at Ibram, we should at least have the satisfaction of seeing all that it contained in the way of sculptures and inscriptions. This was accordingly done, but we worked again next morning just the same till midday. Our native contingent, numbering about 40 men, then made their appearance in a rickety old boat, the bottom of which was half full of water. They had been told to bring implements, and they did bring such as they had, 2 broken oars to dig with, some baskets, and a number of little slips of planking which, being tied between 2 pieces of rope and drawn along the surface, acted as scrapers, and were useful as far as they went. Squatting in double file from the entrance of the speos to the edge of the cliff, and to the burden of a rude chant propelling these improvised scrapers, the men began by clearing a path to the doorway. This gave them work enough for the afternoon. At sunset, when they dispersed, the path was scooped out to a depth of 4 feet, like a miniature railway cutting between embankments of sand. Next morning came the sheikh in person, with his 2 sons and a following of 100 men. This was so many more than we had bargained for, that we at once foresaw a scheme to extort money. The sheikh, however, proved to be that same Rashwan ebn Hassan el-Kashif, by whom the happy couple had been so hospitably entertained about a fortnight before. We therefore received him with honour, invited him to luncheon, and hoping to get the work done, quickly set the men on in gangs under the superintendence of Rais Hassan and the head sailor. By noon the door was cleared down to the threshold, and the whole south and west walls were laid bare to the floor. We now found that the debris which blocked the north wall in the centre of the floor was not, as we had at first supposed, a pile of fallen fragments, but one solid boulder which had come down bodily from above. To remove this was impossible. We had no tools to cut or break it, and it was both wider and higher than the doorway. Even to clear away the sand which rose behind it to the ceiling would have taken a long time, and have caused the inevitable injury to the paintings around. Already the brilliancy of the colour was marred where the men had leaned their backs, all wet with perspiration, against the walls. Seeing, therefore, that 3/4 of the decorations were now uncovered, and that behind the fallen block there appeared to be no subject of great size and importance, we made up our minds to carry the work no further. Meanwhile we all had great fun at luncheon with our Nubian sheikh, a tall, well-featured man with much natural dignity of manner. He was well dressed, too, and wore a white turban most symmetrically folded, a white vest buttoned to the throat, a long loose robe of black serge, an outer robe of fine black cloth with hanging sleeves and a hood, and on his feet white stockings and scarlet morocco shoes. When brought face to face with a knife and fork, his embarrassment was great. He was, it seemed, too grand a personage to feed himself. He must have a feeder, as the great man of the Middle Ages had a taster. Ptolemy, accordingly, being promoted to this office, picked out choice bits of mutton and chicken with his fingers, dropped pieces of bread and gravy, and put every morsel into our guest's august mouth, as if the said guest were a baby. The sweets being served, the little lady, Elle, and the writer took him in hand, and fed him with all kinds of jams and preserved fruits. Enchanted with these attentions, the poor man ate till he could eat no longer, then laid his hand pathetically over the region next to his heart, and cried for mercy. After luncheon he smoked his chibouk, and coffee was served. Our coffee did not please him. He tasted it, but immediately returned the cup, telling the waiter with a grimace that the berries were burned and the coffee weak. When, however, we apologized for it, he protested with oriental insincerity that it was excellent. To amuse him was easy, for he was interested in everything, in L's field glass, in the painter's accordion, in the piano and the lever corkscrew. With some eau de cologne he was also greatly charmed, rubbing it on his beard and inhaling it with closed eyes in a kind of rapture. To make talk was, as usual, the great difficulty. When he had told us that his eldest son was governor of Dare, that his youngest was 5 years of age, that the dates of Dare were better than the dates of Wadi Halfa, and that the Nubian people were very poor, he was at the end of his topics. Finally, he requested us to convey a letter from him to Lord D., who had entertained him on board his dahabeah the year before. Being asked if he had brought his letter with him, he shook his head, saying, "Your dragoman shall write it." So paper and a reed pen were produced, and Ptolemy wrote to dictation as follows: "God have care of you. I hope you are well. I am sorry not to have had a letter from you since you were here. Your brother and friend, Rushwan Ebn Hassan el-Kashif." A model letter this, brief and to the point. Chapter 18. Discoveries at Abu Simbel, Part 2. Our urbane and gentlemanly sheikh was, however, not quite so charming when it came to settling time. We had sent at first for 50 men, and the price agreed upon was 5 piastres, or about a shilling English, for each man per day. In answer to this call, there first came 40 men for half a day, then 100 men for a whole day, or what was called a whole day, so making a total of £6 due for wages. But the descendant of the Kashifs would hear of nothing so commonplace as the simple fulfilment of a straightforward contract. He demanded full pay for 100 men for 2 whole days, a gun for himself, and a liberal baksheesh in cash. Finding he had asked more than he had any chance of getting, he conceded the question of wages, but stood out for a game bag and a pair of pistols. Finally he was obliged to be content with the £6 for his men, and for himself 2 pots of jam, 2 boxes of sardines, a bottle of eau de cologne, a box of pills, and half a sovereign. By 4 o'clock he and his followers were gone, and we once more had the place to ourselves. So long as they were there it was impossible to do anything, but now for the first time we fairly entered into possession of our newly found treasure. All the rest of that day and all the next day we spent at work in and about the Spios. L and the little lady took their books and knitting there, and made a little drawing-room of it. The writer copied paintings and inscriptions. The idle man and the painter took measurements and surveyed the ground round about, especially endeavouring to make out the plan of certain fragments of wall, the foundations of which were yet traceable. A careful examination of these ruins, and a little clearing of the sand here and there, led to further discoveries. They found that the Spios had been approached by a large outer hall built of sun-dried brick, with one principal entrance facing the Nile, and 2 entrances facing northwards. The floor was buried deep in sand and debris, but enough of the walls remained above the surface to show that the ceiling had been vaulted and the side entrances arched. The southern boundary wall of this hall, when the surface sand was removed, appeared to be no less than 20 feet in thickness. This was not in itself so wonderful, there being instances of ancient Egyptian crude brick walls which measure 80 feet in thickness, but it was astonishing as compared with the north, east, and west walls, which measured only 3 feet. Deeming it impossible that this mass could be solid throughout, the idle man set to work with a couple of sailors to probe the centre part of it, and it soon became evident that there was a hollow space about 3 feet in width running due east and west, down not quite exactly the middle of the structure. All at once the idle man thrust his fingers into a skull. This was such an amazing and unexpected incident that for the moment he said nothing, but went on quietly displacing the sand and feeling his way under the surface. The next instant his hand came in contact with the edge of a clay bowl, which he carefully withdrew. It measured about 4 inches in diameter, was hand-moulded, and full of caked sand. He now proclaimed his discoveries, and all ran to help in the work. Soon a second and smaller skull was turned up, then another bowl, and then, just under the place from which the bowls were taken, the bones of 2 skeletons all detached, perfectly desiccated and apparently complete. The remains were those of a child and a small-grown person, probably a woman. The teeth were sound, the bones wonderfully delicate and brittle. As for the little skull, which had fallen apart at the sutures, it was pure and fragile in texture as the cup of a water-lily. We laid the bones aside as we found them, examining every handful of sand in the hope of discovering something that might throw light upon the burial. But in vain. We found not a shred of clothing, not a bead, not a coin, not the smallest vestige of anything that might help one to judge whether the interment had taken place 100 years ago or 1,000. We now called up all the crew, and went on excavating downwards into what seemed to be a long and narrow vault, measuring some 15 feet by 3. After reflection convinced us that we had stumbled upon a chance Nubian grave, and that the bowls, which at first we absurdly dignified with the name of cinerary urns, were but the usual water bowls placed at the heads of the dead. But we were in no mood for reflection at the time. We made sure the speos was a mortuary chapel, that the vault was a vertical pit leading to a sepulchre chamber, and at the bottom of it we should find, who could tell what? Mummies, perhaps, and sarcophagi, and funerary statuettes, and jewels, and papyri, and wonders without end. That these uncared-for bones should be laid in the mouth of such a pit scarcely occurred to us as an incongruity. Supposing them to be Nubian remains, what then? If a modern Nubian at the top, why not an ancient Egyptian at the bottom? As the work of excavation went on, however, the vault was found to be entered by a steep inclined plane. Then the inclined plane turned out to be a flight of much worn and very shallow stairs. These led down to a small square landing some 12 feet below the surface, from which landing an arched doorway and passage opened into the forecourt of the speos. Our sailors had great difficulty in excavating this part, in consequence of the weight of superincumbent sand and debris on the side next the speos. By shoring up the ground, however, they were enabled completely to clear the landing, which was curiously paved with cones of rude pottery like the bottoms of amphorae. These cones, of which we took out some 28 or 30, were not in the least like the celebrated funerary cones found so abundantly at Thebes. They bore no stamp, and were much shorter and more lumpy in shape. Finally, the cones being all removed, we came to a compact and solid floor of baked clay. The painter, meanwhile, had also been at work. Having traced the circuit and drawn out a ground plan, he came to the conclusion that the whole mass adjoining the southern wall of the speos was in fact composed of the ruins of a pylon, the walls of which were 7 feet in thickness, built in regular string courses of moulded brick, and finished at the angles with the usual torus or round moulding. The superstructure, with its chambers, passages, and top cornice, was gone, and this part with which we were now concerned was merely the basement, and included the bottom of the staircase. The painter's ground plan demolished all our hopes at one fell swoop. The vault was a vault no longer. The staircase led to no sepulchre chamber. The brick floor hid no secret entrance. Our mummies melted into thin air, and we were left with no excuse for carrying on the excavations. We were mortally disappointed. In vain we told ourselves that the discovery of a large brick pylon, the existence of which had been unsuspected by preceding travellers, was an event of greater importance than the finding of a tomb. We had set our hearts on a tomb, and I am afraid we cared less than we ought for the pylon. Having traced thus far the course of the excavations and the way in which one discovery led step by step to another, I must now return to the speos, and, as accurately as I can, describe it, not only from my notes made on the spot, but by the light of such observations as I afterwards made among structures of the same style and period. I must, however, premise that, not being able to go inside while the excavators were in occupation, and remaining but one whole day at Abu Simbel after the work was ended, I had but short time at my disposal. I would gladly have made coloured copies of all the wall paintings, but this was impossible. I therefore was obliged to be content with transcribing the inscriptions and sketching a few of the more important subjects. The rock-cut chamber which I have hitherto described as a speos, and which we at first believed to be a tomb, was in fact neither the one nor the other. It was the adytum of a partly built, partly excavated monument coeval in date with the great temple. In certain points of design this monument resembles the contemporary speos of Beit el-Weli. It is evident, for instance, that the outer halls of both were originally vaulted, and the much mutilated sculptures over the doorway of the excavated chamber at Abu Simbel are almost identical in subject and treatment with those over the entrance to the excavated parts of Beit el-Weli. As regards general conception, the Abu Simbel monument comes under the same head with the contemporary temples of Dur, Gurf Hussein, and Wadi Sabua, being in a mixed style which combines excavation with construction. This style seems to have been peculiarly in favour during the reign of Ramesses II. Situate at the south-eastern angle of the rock, a little way beyond the facade of the great temple, this rock-cut adytum and hall of entrance face south-east by east, and command much the same view that is commanded higher up by the temple of Hathor. The adytum, or excavated speos, measures 21 feet 2 1/2 inches in breadth, by 14 feet 8 inches in length. The height from floor to ceiling is about 12 feet. The doorway measures 4 feet 3 1/2 inches in width, and the outer recess for the door frame 5 feet. 2 large circular holes, one in the threshold and the other in the lintel, mark the place of the pivot on which the door once swung. It is not very easy to measure the outer hall in its present ruined and encumbered state, but as nearly as we could judge its dimensions are as follows: length 25 feet, width 22 1/2 feet, width of principal entrance facing the Nile 6 feet, width of 2 side entrances 4 feet and 6 feet respectively, thickness of crude brick walls 3 feet. Engaged in the brickwork on either side of the principal entrance to this hall are 2 stone door jambs, and some 6 or 8 feet in front of these there originally stood 2 stone hawks on hieroglyphed pedestals. One of these hawks we found in situ, the other lay some little distance off, and the painter, suspecting nothing of these after revelations, had used it as a post to which to tie one of the main ropes of his sketching tent. A large hieroglyphed slab, which I take to have formed part of the door, lay overturned against the side of the pylon some few yards nearer the river. As far as the adytum and outer hall are concerned, the accompanying ground plan, which is in part founded on my own measurements, and in part borrowed from the ground plan drawn out by the painter, may be accepted as tolerably correct. But with regard to the pylon, I can only say with certainty that the central staircase is 3 feet in width, and that the walls on each side of it are 7 feet in thickness. So buried is it in debris and sand, that even to indicate where the building ends and the rubbish begins at the end next to the Nile is impossible. This part is therefore left indefinite in the ground plan. So far as we could see, there was no stone revêtement upon the inner side of the walls of the pronaos. If anything of the kind ever existed, some remains of it would probably be found by thoroughly clearing the area, an interesting enterprise for any who may have leisure to undertake it. I have now to speak of the decorations of the adytum, the walls of which, from immediately under the ceiling to within 3 feet of the floor, are covered with religious subjects elaborately sculptured in bas-relief, coated as usual with a thin film of stucco, and coloured with a richness for which I know no parallel, except in the tomb of Seti I at Thebes. Above the level of the drifted sand, this colour was as brilliant in tone and as fresh in surface as on the day when it was transferred to those walls from the palette of the painter. All below that level, however, was dimmed and damaged. The ceiling is surrounded by a frieze of cartouches supported by sacred asps, each cartouche with its supporters being divided from the next by a small sitting figure. These figures, in other respects uniform, wear the symbolic heads of various gods: the cow head of Hathor, the ibis head of Thoth, the hawk head of Horus, the jackal head of Anubis, etc., etc. The cartouches contain the ordinary style and title of Ramesses II, Ra Userma Sotepen Ra Ramesses Mer Amen, and are surmounted by a row of sun discs. Under each sitting god is depicted the phonetic hieroglyph signifying myrrh, or beloved. By means of this device the whole frieze assumes the character of a connected legend, and describes the king not only as beloved of Amun, but as Ramesses, beloved of Hathor, of Thoth, of Horus, in short, of each god depicted in the series. These gods accepted, the frieze is almost identical in design with the frieze in the first hall of the great temple. The west, or principal wall facing the entrance, is divided into two large subjects, each containing two figures the size of life. In the division to the right, Ramesses II worships Ra. In the division to the left, he worships Amun-Ra, thus following the order observed in the other two temples, where the subjects relating to Amun-Ra occupy the left half, and the subjects relating to Ra occupy the right half of each structure. An upright ensign surmounted by an exquisitely drawn and coloured head of Horus Eroes separates these two subjects. In the subject to the right, Ramesses, wearing the red and white shent, presents an offering of two small arebolus vases without handles. The vases are painted blue, and are probably intended to represent lapis lazuli, a substance much prized by the ancient Egyptians, and known to them by the name of kesbet. The king's necklace, armlets, and bracelets are also blue. Ra sits enthroned, holding in one hand the ankh, or crux ansata, emblem of life, and in the other the greyhound-headed sceptre of the gods. He is hawk-headed and crowned with the sun disk and asp. His flesh is painted bright Venetian red. He wears a pectoral ornament, a rich necklace of alternate vermilion and black drops, and a golden yellow belt studded with red and black stones. The throne, which stands on a blue platform, is painted in stripes of red, blue, and white. The platform is decorated with a row of gold-coloured stars and ankh emblems picked out with red. At the foot of this platform, between the god and the king, stands a small altar, on which are placed the usual blue lotus with red stalk, and a spouted libation vessel. To the left of the Horus ensign, seated back to back with Ra upon a similar throne, sits Amun-Ra, of all Egyptian gods the most terrible to look upon, with his blue-black complexion, his corselet of golden chain armour, and his headdress of towering plumes. Here the wonderful preservation of the surface enabled one to see by what means the ancient artists were wont to produce this singular blue-black effect of colour. It was evident that the flesh of the god had first been laid in with dead black, and then coloured over with a dry, powdery cobalt blue, through which the black remained partly visible. He carries in one hand the ankh, and in the other the greyhound-headed sceptre. Ramesses II of Speos. To him advances the king, his right hand uplifted, and in his left a small basket containing a votive statuette of Ma, the goddess of truth and justice. Ma is, however, shorn of her distinctive feather, and holds the jackal-headed staff instead of the customary crux ansata. As portraiture, there is not much to be said for any of these heads of Ramesses II, but the features bear a certain resemblance to the well-known profile of the king. The action of the figure is graceful and animated, and the drawing displays in all its purity the firm and flowing line of Egyptian draughtsmanship. The dress of the king is very rich in colour, the metre-shaped casque being of a vivid cobalt blue, picked out with gold colour, the belt, necklace, armlets, and bracelets of gold, studded apparently with precious stones, the apron green and gold. Over the king's head hovers the sacred vulture, emblem of Mot, holding in her claws a kind of scutcheon upon which is depicted the crux ansata. The south wall. The subjects represented on this wall are as follows. 1. Ramesses, life-size, presiding over a table of offerings. The king wears upon his head the klaft, or headcloth, striped gold and white, and decorated with the areus. The table is piled in the usual way with flesh, fowl, and flowers. The surface being here quite perfect, the details of these objects are seen to be rendered with surprising minuteness. Even the tiny black feather stumps of the plucked geese are given with the fidelity of Chinese art, while a red gash in the breast of each shows in what way it was slain for the sacrifice. The loaves are shaped precisely like the so-called cottage loaves of today, and have the same little depression in the top made by the baker's finger. Lotus and papyrus blossoms in elaborate bouquet holders crown the pile. 2. Two tripods of light and elegant design containing flowers. 3. The bari, or sacred boat, painted gold color, with the usual veil half drawn across the naos, or shrine, the prow of the boat being richly carved, decorated with the Uda, or symbolic eye, and preceded by a large fan of ostrich feathers. The boat is peopled with small black figures, one of which kneels at the stern, while a sphinx couchant with black body and human head keeps watch at the prow. The sphinx symbolizes the king. Chapter 18. Discoveries at Abu Simbel, Part 3. On this wall, in a space between the sacred boat and the figure of Ramesses, occurs the following inscription, sculptured in high relief and elaborately colored. Translation. Said by Thoth, the lord of Sesanu, residing in Amenheri, I give to thee an everlasting sovereignty over the two countries, O son of my body, beloved, Ra-Yusur-Ma Sotep-Unra, acting as propitiator of thy Ka. I give to thee myriads of festivals of Ramesses, beloved of Amen, Ra-Yusur-Ma Sotep-Unra, as prince of every place where the sun disk revolves. The beautiful living God, the maker of beautiful things for his father Thoth, lord of Sesanu, residing in Amenheri. He made mighty and beautiful monuments for ever facing the eastern horizon of heaven. The meaning of which is that Thoth, addressing Ramesses II, then living and reigning, promises him a long life and many anniversaries of his jubilee, in return for the works made in his, Thoth's, honor at Abu Simbel and elsewhere. North Wall. At the upper end of this wall is depicted a life-sized female figure wearing an elaborate blue headdress surmounted by a disc and two ostrich feathers. She holds in her right hand the Ankh, and in her left the jackal-headed scepter. This not being the scepter of a goddess, and the headdress resembling that of the queen as represented on the facade of the Temple of Hathor, I conclude we have here a portrait of Nefertari corresponding to the portrait of Ramesses on the opposite wall. Near her stands a table of offerings, on which, among other objects, are placed 4 vases of a rich blue color traversed by bands of yellow. They perhaps represent the kind of glass known as the false murine. Each of these vases contains an object like a pine, the ground color of which is deep yellow, patterned over with scale-like subdivisions in vermilion. We took them to represent grains of maize pyramidically piled. Lastly, a pendant to that opposite wall comes the sacred bari. It is, however, turned the reverse way, with its prow towards the east, and it rests upon an altar in the center of which are the cartouches of Ramesses II, and a small hieroglyphic inscription signifying, "Beloved by Amun-Ra, king of the gods resident in the land of Kenis." Beyond this point, at the end nearest the northeast corner of the chamber, the piled sand conceals whatever else the wall may contain in the way of decoration. East Wall. If the east wall is decorated like the others, which may be taken for granted, its tableaux and inscriptions are hidden behind the sand which here rises to the ceiling. The doorway also occurs in this wall, occupying a space 4 feet 3 1/2 inches in width on the inner side. One of the most interesting incidents connected with the excavation of this little adytum remains yet to be told. I have described the female figure at the upper end of the north wall, and how she holds in her right hand the Ankh, and in her left the jackal-headed scepter. The hand that holds the Ankh hangs by her side. The hand that holds the scepter is half raised. Close under this upraised hand, at the height of between 3 and 4 feet from the actual level of the floor, there were visible upon the uncolored surface of the original stucco several lines of freehand writing. This writing was laid on, apparently, with the brush, and the ink, if it had ever been black, had now become brown. 5 long lines and 3 shorter lines were uninjured. Below these were traces of other fragmentary lines, almost obliterated by the sand. We knew at once that this quaint, faint writing must be in either the hieratic or demotic hand. We could distinguish, or thought we could distinguish, in its vague outlines of forms already familiar to us in the hieroglyphs, abstracts, as it were, of birds and snakes and boats. There could be no doubt, at all events, that the thing was curious, and we set it down in our minds as the writing of either the architect or decorator of the place. Hieratic inscription, north wall of Speos. Translated by S. Birch, Esquire. Thy son having, thou hast conquered the worlds at once Amun-Ra, Harmachis, the god at the first time, who gives life, health, and a time of many praises to the groom. Of the Ken, son of the royal son of Cush, opener of the road, maker of transport boats, giver of instructions to his lord, Amen Shah. Anxious to make, if possible, an exact facsimile of this inscription, the writer copied it 3 times. The last and best of these copies is here reproduced in photolithography, with a translation from the pen of the late Dr. Birch. We all know how difficult it is to copy correctly in a language of which one is ignorant, and the tiniest curve or dot omitted is fatal to the sense of these ancient characters. In the present instance, notwithstanding the care with which the transcript was made, there must still have been errors, for it has been found undecipherable in places, and in these places there occur inevitable lacunae. Enough, however, remains to show that the lines were written, not as we had supposed by the artist, but by a distinguished visitor, whose name, unfortunately, is illegible. The visitor was a son of the Prince of Cush, or, as it is literally written, the royal son of Cush, that being the official title of the governor of Ethiopia. As there were certainly 8 governors of Ethiopia during the reign of Ramesses II, and perhaps more whose names have not reached us, it is impossible even to hazard a guess at the parentage of our visitor. We gather, however, that he was sent hither to construct a road, also that he built transport boats, and that he exercised priestly functions in that part of the temple which was inaccessible to all but dignitaries of the sacerdotal order. Site, inscriptions, and decorations taken into account, there yet remains this question to be answered. What was the nature and character of the monument just described? It adjoined a pylon, and, as we have seen, consisted of a vaulted pronaos in crude brick, and an adytum excavated in the rock. On the walls of this adytum are depicted various gods with their attributes, votive offerings, and portraits of the king performing acts of adoration. The bari, or ark, is also represented upon the north and south walls of the adytum. These are unquestionably the ordinary features of a temple or chapel. On the other hand, there must be noted certain objections to these premises. It seemed to us that the pylon was built first, and that the south boundary wall of the pronaos, being a subsequent erection, was supported against the slope of the pylon as far as where the spring of the vaulting began. Besides which, the pylon would have been a disproportionately large adjunct to a little monument the entire length of which, from the doorway of the pronaos to the west wall of the adytum, was less than 47 feet. We therefore concluded that the pylon belonged to the large temple, and was erected at the side, instead of in front of the façade, on account of the very narrow space between the mountain and the river. The pylon at Kom Ombo is probably for the same reason placed at the side of the temple and on a lower level. To those who might object that a brick pylon would hardly be attached to a temple of the first class, I would observe that the remains of a similar pylon are still to be seen at the top of what was once the landing place leading to the great temple at Wadi Halfa. It may therefore be assumed that this little monument, although connected with the pylon by means of a doorway and staircase, was an excrescence of later date. Being an excrescence, however, was it, in the strict sense of the word, a temple? Even this seems to be doubtful. In the adytum there is no trace of any altar, no fragment of stone dais or sculptured image, no granite shrine as at Philae, no sacred recess as at Dendera. The standard of Horus Eroes, engraven on page 340, occupies the center place upon the wall facing the entrance, and occupies it not as a tutelary divinity, but as a decorative device to separate the two large subjects already described. Again, the gods represented in these subjects are Ra and Amun-Ra, the tutelary gods of the great temple. But if we turn to the dedicatory inscription on page 344, we find that Thoth, whose image never occurs at all upon the walls, unless as one of the little gods in the cornice, is really the presiding deity of the place. It is he who welcomes Ramesses and his offerings, who acknowledges the glory given to him by his beloved son, and who, in return for the great and good monuments erected in his honor, promises the king that he shall be given an everlasting sovereignty over the two countries. Now Thoth was par excellence the god of letters. He is styled the Lord of divine words, the Lord of the sacred writings, the spouse of truth. He personifies the divine intelligence. He is the patron of art and science, and he is credited with the invention of the alphabet. In one of the most interesting of Champollion's letters from Thebes, he relates how, in the fragmentary ruins of the western extremity of the Ramesseum, he found a doorway adorned with the figures of Thoth and Sapphic. Thoth as the god of literature, and Sapphic inscribed with the title of Lady President of the Hall of Books. At Denderah there was a chamber especially set apart for the sacred writings, and its walls are sculptured all over with a catalogue raisonné of the manuscript treasures of the temple. At Edfu a kind of closet built up between two pillars of the Hall of Assembly was reserved for the same purpose. Every temple, in short, had its library, and as the Egyptian books, being written on papyrus or leather, rolled up and stored in coffers, occupied but little space, the rooms appropriated to this purpose were generally small. It was Dr. Birch's opinion that our little monument may have been the library of the great temple of Abu Simbel. This being the case, the absence of an altar and the presence of Ra and Amun-Ra in the two principal tableaux are sufficiently accounted for. The tutelary deity of the great temple and the patron deity of Ramesses II would naturally occupy, in this subsidiary structure, the same places that they occupy in the principal one, while the library, though in one sense the domain of Thoth, is still under the protection of the gods of the temple to which it is an adjunct. I do not believe we once asked ourselves how it came to pass that the place had remained hidden all these ages long, yet its very freshness proved how early it must have been abandoned. If it had been opened in the time of the successors of Ramesses II, they would probably, as elsewhere, have interpolated inscriptions and cartouches, or have substituted their own cartouches for those of the founder. If it had been opened in the time of the Ptolemies and Caesars, travelling Greeks and learned Romans and strangers from Byzantium and the cities of Asia Minor would have cut their names on the door jambs and scribbled ex votos on the walls. If it had been opened in the days of Nubian Christianity, the sculptures would have been coated with mud, and washed with lime, and daubed with pious caricatures of St. George and the Holy Family. But we found it intact, as perfectly preserved as a tomb that had lain hidden under the rocky bed of the desert. For these reasons, I am inclined to think that it became inaccessible shortly after it was completed. There can be little doubt that a wave of earthquake passed during the reign of Ramesses II, along the left bank of the Nile, beginning possibly above Wadi Halfa and extending at least as far north as Gurf Hussein. Such a shock might have wrecked the temple at Wadi Halfa as it dislocated the pylon of Wadi Sabua and shook the built-out porticos of Dur and Gurf Hussein, which last four temples, as they do not, I believe, show signs of having been added to by later pharaohs, may be supposed to have been abandoned in consequence of the ruin which had befallen them. Here, at all events, it shook the mountain of the great temple, cracked one of the Osiride columns of the first hall, shattered one of the four great colossi, more or less injured the other three, flung down the great brick pylon, reduced the pronaos of the library to a heap of ruin, and not only brought down part of the ceiling of the excavated adytum, but rent open a vertical fissure in the rock some 20 or 25 feet in length. With so much irreparable damage done to the great temple, and with so much that was repairable calling for immediate attention, It is no wonder that these brick buildings were left to their fate. The priests would have rescued the sacred books from among the ruins, and then the place would have been abandoned. So much by way of conjecture. As hypothesis, a sufficient reason is perhaps suggested for the wonderful state of preservation in which the little chamber had been handed down to the present time. A rational explanation is also offered for the absence of later cartouches, of Greek and Latin ex-votos, of Christian emblems, and of subsequent mutilation of every kind. For, save that one contemporary visitor, the son of the royal son of Cush, the place contained, when we opened it, no record of any passing traveller, no defacing autograph of tourist, archaeologist, or scientific explorer. Neither Belzoni nor Champollion had found it out, even Lepsius had passed it by. It happens sometimes that hidden things, which in themselves are easy to find, escape detection because no one thinks of looking for them. But such was not the case in this present instance. Search had been made here again and again, and even quite recently. It seems that when the Khedive entertains distinguished guests and sends them in gorgeous dahabiyas up the Nile, he grants them a virgin mound, or so many square feet of a famous necropolis, lets them dig as deep as they please, and allows them to keep whatever they may find. Sometimes he sends out scouts to beat the ground, and then a tomb is found and left unopened, and the illustrious visitor is allowed to discover it. When the scouts are unlucky, it may even sometimes happen that an old tomb is restocked, carefully closed up, and then with all the charm of unpremeditation reopened a day or two after. Now Sheikh Rashwan Ebn Hassan el-Kashif told us that in 1869, when the Empress of the French was at Abu Simbel, and again when the Prince and Princess of Wales came up in 1872, after the Prince's illness, he received strict orders to find some hitherto undiscovered tomb, in order that the Khedive's guest might have the satisfaction of opening it. But, he added, although he left no likely place untried among the rocks and valleys on both sides of the river, he could find nothing. To have unearthed such a Berba as this would have done him good service with the government, and have ensured him a splendid bakshish from prince or empress. As it was, he was reprimanded for want of diligence, and he believed himself to have been out of favour ever since. I may here mention, in order to have done with this subject, that besides being buried outside to a depth of 8 feet, the adytum had been partially filled inside by a gradual infiltration of sand from above. This can only have accumulated at the time when the old sand drift was at its highest. That drift, sweeping in one unbroken line across the front of the great temple, must at one time have risen to a height of 20 feet above the present level. From thence the sand had found its way down the perpendicular fissure already mentioned. In the corner behind the door the sand pile rose to the ceiling, in shape just like the deposit at the bottom of an hourglass. I am informed by the painter that when the top of the doorway was found and an opening first effected, the sand poured out from within like water escaping from an opened sluice. Here, then, is positive proof, if proof were needed, that we were first to enter the place, at all events since the time when the great sand-drift rose as high as the top of the fissure. The painter wrote his name and ours with the date, February 16, 1874, on a space of blank wall over the inside of the doorway, and this was the only occasion upon which any of us left our names upon an Egyptian monument. On arriving at Carrasco, where there is a post office, he also dispatched a letter to the Times, briefly recording the facts here related. That letter, which appeared on the 18th of March following, is reprinted in the appendix at the end of this book. I am told that our names are partially effaced, and that the wall paintings which we had the happiness of admiring in all their beauty and freshness are already much injured. Such is the fate of every Egyptian monument, great or small. The tourist carves it all over with names and dates, and in some instances with caricatures. The student of Egyptology, by taking wet paper squeezes, sponges away every vestige of the original color. The collector buys and carries off everything of value that he can get, and the Arab steals for him. The work of destruction meanwhile goes on apace. There is no one to prevent it, there is no one to discourage it. Every day more inscriptions are mutilated, more tombs are rifled, more paintings and sculptures are defaced. The Louvre contains a full-length portrait of Seti I, cut out bodily from the walls of his sepulchre in the valley of the tombs of the kings. The museums of Berlin, of Turin, of Florence are rich in spoils which tell their own lamentable tale. When science leads the way, is it wonderful that ignorance should follow? Chapter 19. Back Through Nubia, Part 1. There are 14 temples between Abu Simbel and Philae, to say nothing of grottos, tombs, and other ruins. As a rule, people begin to get tired of temples about this time, and vote them too plentiful. Meek travellers go through them as a duty, but the greater number rebel. Our happy couple, I grieve to say, went over to the majority. Dead to shame, they openly proclaimed themselves bored. They even skipped several temples. For myself, I was never bored by them. Though they had been twice as many, I should not have wished them fewer. Miss Martineau tells how, in this part of the river, she was scarcely satisfied to sit down to breakfast without having first explored a temple. But I could have breakfasted, dined, supped on temples. My appetite for them was insatiable, and grew with what it fed upon. I went over them all. I took notes of them all. I sketched them every one. I may as well say at once that I shall reproduce but few of those notes, and only some of those sketches in the present volume. If, surrounded by their local associations, these ruins fail to interest many who travel far to see them, it is not to be supposed that they would interest readers at home. Here and there, perhaps, might be one who would care to pore with me over every broken sculpture, to spell out every half-legible cartouche, to trace through Greek and Roman influences, which are nowhere more conspicuous than in these Nubian buildings, the slow deterioration of the Egyptian style. But the world for the most part reserves itself, and rightly, for the great epochs and the great names of the past, and because it has not yet had too much of Karnak, of Abu Simbel, of the pyramids, it sets slight store by these minor monuments which record the periods of foreign rule and the decline of native art. For these reasons, therefore, I propose to dismiss very briefly many places upon which I bestowed hours of delightful labor. We left Abu Simbel just as the moon was rising on the evening of the 18th of February, and dropped down with the current for 3 or 4 miles before mooring for the night. At 6 next morning the men began rowing, and at 8:30 the heads of the colossi were still looking placidly after us across a ridge of intervening hills. They were then more than 5 miles distant in a direct line, but every feature was still distinct in the early daylight. One went up again and again as long as they remained in sight, and bade good-bye to them at last with that same heartache which comes of a farewell view of the Alps. When I say that we were 17 days getting from Abu Simbel to Philae, and that we had the wind against us from sunrise to sunset almost every day, it will be seen that our progress was of the slowest. To those who were tired of temples, and to the crew who were running short of bread, these long days of lying up under the bank, of rocking to and fro in the middle of the river, were dreary enough. Slowly but surely, however, the hard-won miles go by. Sometimes the barren desert hems us in to right and left, with never a blade of green between the rock and the river. Sometimes, as at Tosco, we come upon an open tract, where there are palms and castorberry plantations and cornfields alive with quail. The idle man goes ashore at Tosco with his gun, while the little lady and the rider climb a solitary rock about 200 feet above the river. The bank shelves here, and a crescent-like wave of inundation, about 3 miles in length, overflows it every season. From this height one sees exactly how far the wave goes, and how it must make a little bay when it is there. Now it is a bay of barley, full to the brim and rippling with the breeze. Beyond the green comes the desert, the one defined against the other as sharply as water against land. The desert looks wonderfully old beside the young green of the corn, and the Nile flows wide among sandbanks like a tidal river near the sea. The village, squared off in parallelograms like a cattle market, lies mapped out below. A field glass shows that the houses are simply cloistered courtyards roofed with palm thatch, the sheikh's house being larger than the rest, with the usual open space and spreading sycamore in front. There are women moving to and fro in the courtyards, and husbandmen in the castorberry patches. A funeral with a train of wailers goes out presently towards the burial ground on the edge of the desert. The idle man, a slight figure with a veil twisted round his hat, wades, half hidden through the barley, signaling his whereabouts every now and then by a puff of white smoke. A cargo boat, stripped and shorn, comes floating down the river, making no visible progress. A native felucca carrying one tattered brown sail goes swiftly up with the wind at a pace that will bring her to Abu Simbel before nightfall. Already she has passed the village, and those black specks yonder, which we had never dreamed were crocodiles, have slipped off into the water at her approach. And now she is far in the distance, that glowing, illimitable distance, traversed by long silvery reaches of river, and ending in a vast flat, so blue and aerial that, but for some 3 or 4 notches of purple peaks on the horizon, one could scarcely discern the point at which land and sky melt into each other. Ibrim comes next, then Dur, then Wadi Sabua. At Ibrim, as at Dur, there are fair families whose hideous light hair and blue eyes, grafted on brown-black skins, date back to Bosnian forefathers of 360 years ago. These people give themselves airs, and are the haute noblesse of the place. The men are lazy and quarrelsome. The women trail longer robes, wear more beads and rings, and are altogether more unattractive and castor-oily than any we have seen elsewhere. They keep slaves, too. We saw these unfortunates trotting at the heels of their mistresses like dogs. Knowing slavery to be officially illegal in the dominions of the Khedive, the M.B.s applied to a dealer who offered them an Abyssinian girl for £10. This useful article, warranted a bargain, was to sweep, wash, milk, and churn, but was not equal to cooking. The M.B.s, it is needless to add, having verified the facts, retired from the transaction. At Dare we pay a farewell visit to the temple, and at Amada, arriving towards close of day, we see the great view for the last time in the glory of sunset. And now, though the north wind blows persistently, it gets hotter every day. The crocodiles like it, and come out to bask in the sunshine. Called up one morning in the middle of breakfast, we see 2, a little one and a big one, on a sandbank near by. The men rest upon their oars. The boat goes with the stream. No one speaks, no one moves. Breathlessly and in dead silence we drift till we are close beside them. The big one is rough and black like the trunk of a London elm, and measures full 18 feet in length. The little one is pale and greenish, and glistens like glass. All at once the old one starts, doubles itself up for a spring, and disappears with a tremendous splash. But the little one, apparently unconscious of danger, lifts its tortoise-like head, and eyes us sidewise. Presently someone whispers, and that whisper breaks the spell. Our little crocodile flings up its tail, plunges down the bank, and is gone in a moment. The crew could not understand how the idle man, after lying in wait for crocodiles at Abu Simbel, should let this rare chance pass without a shot. But we had heard since then of so much indiscriminate slaughter at the Second Cataract, that he was resolved to bear no part in the extermination of those old historic reptiles. That a sportsman should wish for a single trophy is not unreasonable, but that scores of cracked shot should go up every winter, killing and wounding these wretched brutes at an average rate from 12 to 18 per gun, is mere butchery, and cannot be too strongly reprehended. Year by year the creatures become shyer and fewer, and the day is probably not far distant when a crocodile will be as rarely seen below Semna as it is now rarely seen below Aswan. The thermometer stands at 85 degrees in the saloon of the Philae when we come one afternoon to Wadi Sabua, where there is a solitary temple drowned in sand. It was approached once by an avenue of sphinxes and standing colossi, now shattered and buried. The roof of the pronaos, if it was ever roofed, is gone. The inner halls and the sanctuary, all excavated in the rock, are choked and impassable. Only the propylon stands clear of sand, and that, massive as it is, looks as if one touch of a battering ram would bring it to the ground. Every huge stone in it is loose. Every block in the cornice seems tottering in its place. In all this we fancy we recognize the work of our Abu Simbel earthquake. At Wadi Sabua we see a fat native. The fact claims record because it is so uncommon. A stalwart, middle-aged man, dressed in a tattered kilt and carrying a palm staff in his hand, he stands before us the living double of the famous wooden statue at Bulak. He is followed by his 2 wives and 3 or 4 children, all bent upon trade. The women have trinkets, the boys a live chameleon and a small stuffed crocodile for sale. While the painter is bargaining for the crocodile and L for a nose ring, the writer makes acquaintance with a pair of self-important hoopoes who live in the pylon and evidently regard it as a big nest of their own building. They sit observing me curiously while I sketch, nodding their crested polls and chattering disparagingly, like a couple of critics. By and by comes a small black bird with a white breast, and sings deliciously. It is like no little bird that I have ever seen before, but the song that pours so lavishly from its tiny throat is as sweet and brilliant as a canary's. Powerless against the wind, the dahabeah lies idle day after day in the sun. Sometimes when we chance to be near a village, the natives squat on the bank and stare at us for hours together. The moment anyone appears on deck, they burst into a chorus of baksheesh. There is but one way to get rid of them, and that is to sketch them. The effect is instantaneous. With a good-sized block and a pencil, a whole village may be put to flight at a moment's notice. If, on the other hand, one wishes for a model, the difficulty is insuperable. The painter tried in vain to get some of the women and girls, not a few of whom were really pretty, to sit for their portraits. I well remember one haughty beauty, shaped and draped like a Juno, who stood on the bank one morning, scornfully watching all that was done on deck. She carried a flat basket, back-handed, and her arms were covered with bracelets, and her fingers with rings. Her little girl, in a Madame Nubia fringe, clung to her skirts, half wondering, half frightened. The painter sent out an ambassador plenipotentiary to offer anything from sixpence to half a sovereign if she would only stand like that for half an hour. The manner of her refusal was grand. She drew her shawl over her face, took her child's hand, and stalked away like an offended goddess. The writer, meanwhile, hidden behind a curtain, had snatched a tiny sketch from the cabin window. On the western bank, somewhere between Wadi Sabua and Maharaka, in a spot quite bare of vegetation, stands the ruins of a fortified town, which is neither mentioned by Murray nor entered in the maps. It is built high on a base of reddish rock, and commands the river and the desert. The painter and writer explored it one afternoon in the course of a long ramble. Climbing first a steep slope strewn with masonry, we came to the remains of a stone gateway. Finding this impassable, we made our way through a breach in the battlemented wall, and thence up a narrowed road down which had been poured a cataract of debris. Skirting a ruined postern at the top of this road, we found ourselves in a close labyrinth of vaulted arcades built of crude brick, and lit at short intervals by openings in the roof. These strange streets, for they were streets, were lined on either side by small dwellings built of crude brick on stone foundations. We went into some of the houses, mere ruined courts and roofless chambers, in which were no indications of hearths or staircases. In one lay a fragment of stone column about 14 inches in diameter. The air in these ancient streets was foul and stagnant, and the ground was everywhere heaped with fragments of black, red, and yellowish pottery, like the shards of elephantine and Philae. A more desolate place in a more desolate situation I never saw. It looked as if it had been besieged, sacked, and abandoned 1,000 years ago, which is probably under the mark, for the character of the pottery would seem to point to the period of Roman occupation. Noting how the brick superstructures were reared on apparently earlier masonry, we concluded that the beginnings of this place were probably Egyptian, and the later work Roman. The marvel was that any town should have been built in so barren a spot, there being not so much as an inch-wide border of lentils for a mile or more between the river and the desert. Having traversed the place from end to end, we came out through another breach on the westward side, and thinking to find a sketchable point of view inland, struck down towards the plain. In order to reach this, one must first skirt a deep ravine which divides the rock of the citadel from the desert. Following the brink of this ravine to the point at which it falls into the level, we found to our great surprise that we were treading the banks of an extinct river. It was full of sand now, but beyond all question it had once been full of water. It came evidently from the mountains over towards the northwest. We could trace its windings for a long way across the plain, thence through the ravine, and on southwards in a line parallel with the Nile. Here beneath our feet were the water-worn rocks through which it had fretted its way, and yonder, half buried in sand, were the boulders it had rounded and polished, and borne along in its course. I doubt, however, if when it was a river of water this stream was half as beautiful as now, when it is a river of sand. It was turbid then, no doubt, and charged with sediment. Now it is more golden than Pactolus, and covered with ripples more playful and undulating than were ever modelled by Canaletti's pencil. Supposing yonder town to have been founded in the days when the river was a river, and the plain fertile and well watered, the mystery of its position is explained. It was protected in front by the Nile, and in the rear by the ravine and the river. But how long ago was this? Here apparently was an independent stream, taking its rise among the Libyan mountains. It dated back, consequently, to a time when these barren hills collected and distributed water; that is to say, to a time when it used to rain in Nubia. And that time must have been before the rocky barrier broke down at Silsilis, in the old days when the land of Cush flowed with milk and honey. It would rain even now in Nubia if it could. That same evening when the sun was setting we saw a fan-like drift of dappled cloud miles high above our heads, melting, as it seemed, in fringes of iridescent vapour. We could distinctly see those fringes forming, wavering, and evaporating, unable to descend as rain, because dispersed at a high altitude by radiated heat from the desert. This, with one exception, was the only occasion on which I saw clouds in Nubia. Coming back, we met a solitary native, with a string of beads in his hand and a knife up his sleeve. He followed us for a long way, volunteering a but half-intelligible story about some unknown Berber in the desert. We asked where it was, and he pointed up the course of our unknown river. "You have seen it?" said the painter. "Maret Keter, many times." "How far is it?" "1 day's march in the Hagar desert." "And have no Inglese ever been to look for it?" He shook his head at first, not understanding the question, then looked grave and held up one finger. Our stock of Arabic was so small, and his so interlarded with Kenzie, that we had great difficulty in making out what he said next. We gathered, however, that some Hawaji, travelling alone and on foot, had once gone in search of this Berber, and never come back. Was he lost? Was he killed? Who could say? "It was a long time ago," said the man with the beads. "It was a long time ago, and he took no guide with him." We would have given much to trace the river to its source, and search for this unknown temple in the desert. But it is one of the misfortunes of this kind of travelling that one cannot easily turn aside from the beaten track. The hot season is approaching, the river is running low, the daily cost of the dahabeah is exorbitant, and in Nubia, where little or nothing can be bought in the way of food, the dilatory traveller risks starvation. It was something, however, to have seen with one's own eyes that the Nile, instead of flowing for a distance of 1,200 miles unfed by any affluent, had here received waters of a tributary. To those who have a south breeze behind them, the temples must now follow in quick succession. We, however, achieved them by degrees, and rejoiced when our helpless dahabeah lay within rowing reach of anything worth seeing. Thus we pulled down one day to Maharaka, in itself a dull ruin, but picturesquely desolate. Seen as one comes up the bank on landing, 2 parallel rows of columns stand boldly up against the sky, supporting a ruined entablature. In the foreground a few stunted dome palms starve in an arid soil. The barren desert closes in the distance. We are beset here by an insolent crowd of savage-looking men and boys, and impudent girls with long frizzy hair and Nubian fringes, who pester us with beads and pebbles, dance, shout, slap their legs and clap their hands in our faces, and pelt us when we go away. One ragged warrior brandishes an antique brass-mounted firelock full 6 feet long in the barrel, and some of the others carry slender spears. The temple, a late Roman structure, would seem to have been wrecked by earthquake before it was completed. The masonry is all in the rough, pillars as they came from the quarry, capitals blocked out, waiting for the carver. These unfinished ruins, of which every stone looks new as if the work was still in progress, affect one's imagination strangely. On a fallen wall south of the portico, the idle man detected some remains of a Greek inscription, but for hieroglyphic characters or cartouches by which to date the building, we looked in vain. Chapter 19. Back Through Nubia, Part 2. Dacca comes next in order, then Gurf Hussein, Dendur, and Kalabsha. Arriving at Dacca soon after sunrise, we find the whole population, screaming, pushing, chattering, laden with eggs, pigeons, and gourds for sale, drawn up to receive us. There is a large sand island in the way, so we moor about a mile above the temple. We first saw the twin pylons of Dacca some weeks ago from the deck of the Philae, and we likened them to the majestic towers of Edfu. Approaching them now by land, we are surprised to find them so small. It is a brilliant, hot morning, and our way lies by the river, between the lentil slope and the castorberry patches. There are flocks of pigeons flying low overhead, barking dogs and crowing cocks in the village close by, and all over the path hundreds of beetles, real live scarabs, black as coal and busy as ants, rolling their clay pellets up from the water's edge to the desert. If we were to examine a score or so of these pellets, we should here and there find one that contained no eggs, for it is a curious fact that the scarab beetle makes and rolls her pellets whether she has an egg to deposit or not. The female beetle, though assisted by the male, is said to do the heavier share of the pellet rolling, and if evening comes on before her pellet is safely stowed away, she will sleep holding it with her feet all night, and resume her labor in the morning. The temple here, begun by an Ethiopian king named Archiman Ergamemnes, about whom Diodorus has a long story to tell, and carried on by the Ptolemies and Caesars, stands in a desolate open space to the north of the village, and is approached by an avenue, the walls of which are constructed with blocks from some other earlier building. The whole of this avenue, and all the waste ground for 300 or 400 yards around the temple, is not merely strewn but piled with fragments of pottery, pebbles, and large smooth stones of phosphorix, alabaster, basalt, and a kind of marble like verde antico. These stones are puzzling. They look as if they might be fragments of statues that had been rolled and polished by ages of friction in the bed of a torrent. Among the potsherds we find some inscribed fragments, like those of Elephantine. Of the temple I will only say that, as masonry, it is better put together than any work of the 18th or 19th dynasties with which I am acquainted. The sculptures, however, are atrocious. Such misshapen hieroglyphs, such dumpy, smirking goddesses, such clownish kings, and such preposterous head-dressings, we have never seen till now. The whole thing, in short, as regards sculpturesque style, is the Ptolemaic out-Ptolemaied. Rowing round presently to Caban, the river running wide, with the sand island in between, we land under the walls of a huge crude brick structure, black with age, which at first sight looks quite shapeless, but which proves to be an ancient Egyptian fortress, buttressed, towered, loopholed, finished at the angles with invariable moulded torus, and surrounded by a deep dry moat, which is probably yet filled each summer by the inundation. Now of all rare things in the valley of the Nile, a purely secular ruin is the rarest, and this, with the exception of some foundations of dwellings here and there, is the first we have seen. It is probably very, very old, as old as the days of Thutmose III, whose name is found on some scattered blocks about a quarter of a mile away, and who built two similar fortresses at Semneh, 35 miles above Wadi Halfa. It may be 1,000 years older still, and date from the time of Amenemhat III, whose name is also found on a stela near Koban. For here was once an ancient city, when Pelsix, now Dacca, was but a new suburb on the opposite bank. The name of this ancient city is lost, but it is by some supposed to be identical with the Metacompso of Ptolemy. As the suburb grew, the mother town declined, and in time the suburb became the city, and the city became the suburb. The scattered blocks aforesaid, together with the remains of a small temple, yet mark the position of the elder city. The walls of this most curious and interesting fortress have probably lost much of their original height. They are in some parts 30 feet thick, and nowhere less than 20. They are built at a buttress slope outside, with additional shallow buttresses at regular distances. These last, as they can scarcely add to the enormous strength of the original wall, were probably designed for effect. There are 2 entrances to the fortress, one in the center of the north wall and one in the south. We enter the enclosure by the last named, and find ourselves in the midst of an immense parallelogram measuring about 450 feet from east to west, and perhaps 300 feet from north to south. All within these bounds is a wilderness of ruin. The space looks large enough for a city, and contains what might be the debris of a dozen cities. We climb huge mounds of rubbish, skirt cataracts of broken pottery, and stand on the brink of excavated pits, honeycombed 40 feet below with brick foundations. Over these mounds and at the bottom of these pits swarm men, women, and children, filling and carrying away basket loads of rubble. The dust rises in clouds. The noise, the heat, the confusion are indescribable. One pauses, bewildered, seeking in vain to discover in this mighty maze any indication of a plan. It is only by an effort that one gradually realizes how the place is but a vast shell, and how all these mounds and pits mark the site of what was once a huge edifice rising tower above tower to a central keep, such as we see represented on the battle subjects of Abu Simbel and Thebes. That towered edifice and central keep, quarried, broken up, carried away piecemeal, reduced to powder, and spread over the land as manure, has now disappeared almost to its foundations. Only the well in the middle of the enclosure and the great wall of circuit remain. That wall is doomed, and will by and by share the fate of the rest. The well, which must have been very deep, is choked with rubbish to the brim. Meanwhile, in order to realize what the place in its present condition is like, one need but imagine how the Tower of London would look if the whole of the inner buildings, White Tower, chapel, armory, governor's quarters and all, were levelled in shapeless ruin, and only the outer walls and moat were left. Built up against the inner side of the wall of circuit are the remains of a series of massive towers, the tops of which, as they are strangely enough shorter than the external structure, can never have communicated with the battlements, unless by ladders. The finest of these towers, together with a magnificent fragment of wall, faces the eastern desert. Going out by the north entrance, we find the sides of the gateway, and even the steps leading down into the moat, in perfect preservation, while at the base of the great wall, on the outer side facing the river, there yet remains a channel or conduit about 2 feet square, built and roofed with stone, which in Murray is described as a water gate. The sun is high, the heat is overwhelming, the felucca waits, and we turn reluctantly away, knowing that between here and Cairo we shall see no more curious relic of the far-off past than this dismantled stronghold. It is a mere mountain of unburnt brick, altogether unlovely, admirable only for the gigantic strength of its proportions, pathetic only in the abjectness of its ruin. Yet it brings the lost ages home to one's imagination in a way that no temple ever could bring them. It dispels for a moment the historic glamour of the sculptures, and compels us to remember those nameless and forgotten millions, of whom their rulers fashioned soldiers in time of war and builders in time of peace. Our adventures by the way are few and far between, and now we rarely meet a dahabeah. Birds are more plentiful than when we were in this part of the river a few weeks ago. We see immense flights of black and white cranes congregated at night on the sandbanks, and any number of quail may be had for the shooting. It is a matter for rejoicing when the idle man goes out with his gun and brings home a full bag, for our last sheep was killed before we started for Wadi Halfa, and our last poultry ceased cackling at Abu Simbel. One morning early we see a bride taken across the river in a big boat full of women and girls, who are clapping their hands and shrilling the tremendous zagharit. The bride, a chocolate beauty with magnificent eyes, wears a gold brow pendant and nose ring, and has her hair newly plaited in hundreds of tails, finished off at the ends with mud pellets daubed with yellow ochre. She stands surrounded by her companions, proud of her finery, and pleased to be stared at by the Inglese. About this time, also, we see one night a wild sort of festival going on for some miles along both sides of the river. Watch-fires break out towards twilight, first on this bank, then on that, becoming brighter and more numerous as the darkness deepens. By and by, when we are going to bed, we hear sounds of drumming on the eastern bank, and see from afar a torchlight procession and dance. The effect of this dance of torches, for it is only the torches that are visible, is quite diabolic. The lights flit and leap as if they were alive, circling, clustering, dispersing, bobbing, poussetting, pursuing each other at a gallop, and whirling every now and then through the air like rockets. Late as it is, we would fain put ashore and see this orgy more nearly, but Rais Hassan shakes his head. The natives hereabout are said to be quarrelsome, and if, as it is probable, they are celebrating the festival of some local saint, we might be treated as intruders. Coming at early morning to Gurf Hussein, we make our way up to the temple, which is excavated in the face of a limestone cliff, a couple of 100 feet, perhaps, above the river. A steep path, glaring hot in the sun, leads to a terrace in the rock, the temple being approached through the ruins of a built-out portico and an avenue of battered colossi. It is a gloomy place within, an inferior edition, so to say, of the great temple of Abu Simbel, and of the same date. It consists of a first hall supported by Osiride pillars, a second and smaller hall with square columns, a smoke-blackened sanctuary, and 2 side chambers. The Osiride colossi, which stand 20 feet high without the entablature over their heads or the pedestal under their feet, are thick-set, bow-legged, and misshapen. Their faces would seem to have been painted black originally, while those of the avenue outside have distinctly Ethiopian features. One seems to detect here, as at Dur and Wadi Sabua, the work of provincial sculptors, just as at Abu Simbel one recognizes the master style of the artist of the Theban Ramesseum. The great side chambers at Gurf Hussein are infested with bats. These bats are the great sight of the place, and have their appointed showman. We find him waiting for us with an end of tarred rope, which he flings blazing into the pitch-dark doorway. For a moment we see the whole ceiling hung, as it were, with a close fringe of white, filmy-looking pendants. But it is only for a moment. The next instant the creatures are all in motion, dashing out madly in our faces like driven snowflakes. We picked up a dead one afterwards, when the rush was over, and examined it by the outer daylight, a lovely little creature, white and downy, with fine transparent wings and little pink feet, and the prettiest, mousy mouth imaginable. Bordered with dwarf palms, acacias, and henna bushes, the cliffs between Gurf Hussein and Dendur stand out in detached masses, so like ruins that sometimes we can hardly believe they are rocks. At Dendur, when the sun is setting and a delicious gloom is stealing up the valley, we visit a tiny temple on the western bank. It stands out above the river, surrounded by a wall of enclosure, and consists of a single pylon, a portico, 2 little chambers, and a sanctuary. The whole thing is like an exquisite toy, so covered with sculptures, so smooth, so new-looking, so admirably built. Seeing them half by sunset, half by dusk, it matters not that these delicately wrought bas-reliefs are of the decadence school. The rosy half-light of an Egyptian afterglow covers a multitude of sins, and steeps the whole in an atmosphere of romance. Wondering what has happened to the climate, we wake shivering next morning an hour or so before break of day, and for the first time in several weeks taste the old early chill upon the air. When the sun rises, we find ourselves at Kalebsha, having passed the limit of the tropic during the night. Henceforth, no matter how great the heat may be by day, this chill invariably comes with the dark hour before dawn. The usual yelling crowd, with the usual beads, baskets, eggs, and pigeons for sale, greets us on the shore at Kalebsha. One of the men has a fine old 2-handed sword in a shabby blue velvet sheath, for which he asks 5 Napoleons. It looks as if it might have belonged to a crusader. Some of the women bring buffalo cream in filthy-looking black skins slung round their waists like girdles. The cream is excellent, but the skins temper one's enjoyment of the unaccustomed dainty. There is a magnificent temple here, and close by, excavated in the cliff, a rock-cut speos, the local name of which is Beit el Weli. The sculptures of this famous speos have been more frequently described and engraved than almost any sculptures in Egypt. The procession of Ethiopian tribute dealers, the assault of the Amorite city, the triumph of Rameses, are familiar not only to every reader of Wilkinson, but to every visitor passing through the Egyptian rooms of the British Museum. Notwithstanding the casts that have been taken from them, and the ill treatment to which they have been subjected, by natives and visitors, they are still beautiful. The colour of those in the roofless courtyard, though so perfect when Bonomi executed his admirable facsimiles, has now almost entirely peeled off, but in the portico and inner chambers it is yet brilliant. An emerald green Osiris, a crimson Anubis, and an Isis of the brightest chrome yellow are astonishingly pure and forcible in quality. As for the flesh tones of the Anubis, this was, I believe, the only instance I observed of a true crimson in Egyptian pigments. Between the speos of Beit el Weli and the neighbouring temple of Calebsha, there lies about half a mile of hilly pathway and a gulf of 1400 years. Rameses ushers us into the presence of Augustus, and we pass, as it were, from an oratory in the great house of Pharaoh to the presence chamber of the Caesars. But if the decorative work in the presence chamber of the Caesars was anything like the decorative work in the temple of Calebsha, then the taste thereof was of the vilest. Such a masquerade of deities, such striped and spotted and cross-barred robes, such outrageous head-dresses, such crude and violent colouring, we have never seen the like of. As for the goddesses, they are gaudier than the dancing damsels of Luxor, while the kings balance on their heads diadems compounded of horns, moons, birds, balls, beetles, lotus blossoms, asps, vases, and feathers. The temple, however, is conceived on a grand scale. It is the Karnak of Nubia. But it is a Karnak that has evidently been visited by a shock of earthquake far more severe than that which shook the mighty pillars of the hypostyle hall and flung down the obelisk of Hatassu. From the river it looks like a huge fortress, but seen from the threshold of the main gateway, it is a wilderness of ruin. Fallen blocks, pillars, capitals, entablatures lie so extravagantly piled that there is not one spot in all those halls and courtyards upon which it is possible to set one's foot on the level of the original pavement. Here again the earthquake seems to have come before the work was completed. There are figures outlined on the walls, but never sculpted. Others have been begun, but never finished. You can see where the chisel stopped. You can even detect which was the last mark it made on the surface. One traces here, in fact, the 4 processes of wall decoration. In some places the space is squared off and ruled by the mechanic. In others the subject is ready drawn within those spaces by the artist. Here the sculptor has carried it a stage further. Yonder the painter has begun to colour it. More interesting, however, than aught else at Calebsha is the Greek inscription of Silko of Ethiopia. This inscription, made famous by the commentaries of Niebuhr and Latronne, was discovered by M. Gah in A.D. 1818. It consists of 21 lines very neatly written in red ink, and it dates from the 6th century of the Christian era. It commences thus: I, Silko, puissant king of the Nubians and all the Ethiopians, I came twice as far as Talmis and Taphis. I fought against the Blames, and God granted me the victory. I vanquished them a second time, and the first time I established myself completely with my troops. I vanquished them, and they supplicated me. I made peace with them, and they swore to me by their idols. I trusted them, because they are a people of good faith. Then I returned to my dominions in the upper country, for I am a king. Not only am I no follower in the train of other kings, but I go before them. As for those who seek strife against me, I give them no peace in their homes till they entreat my pardon. For I am a lion on the plains, and a goat upon the mountains, etc., etc., etc. The historical value of this inscription is very great. It shows that in the 6th century, while the native inhabitants of this part of the valley of the Nile yet adhered to the ancient Egyptian faith, the Ethiopians of the south were professedly Christian. The descendants of the Blamus are a fine race, tall, strong, and of a rich chocolate complexion. Strolling through the village at sunset, we see the entire population, old men sitting at their doors, young men lounging and smoking, children at play. The women, with glittering white teeth and liquid eyes, and a profusion of gold and silver ornaments on neck and brow, come out with their little brown babies astride on hip or shoulder, to stare as we go by. One sick old woman, lying outside her hut on a palm wood couch, raises herself for a moment on her elbow, then sinks back with a weary sigh, and turns her face to the wall. The mud dwellings here are built in and out of a maze of massive stone foundations, the remains of a building once magnificent. Some of these walls are built in concave courses, each course of stones, that is to say, being depressed in the centre and raised at the angles, which mode of construction was adopted in order to offer less resistance when shaken by earthquakes. We observe more foundations built thus at Taffa, where we arrive next morning. As the masons' work at Taffa is of late Roman date, it follows that earthquakes were yet frequent in Nubia at a period long subsequent to the great shock of B.C. 27, mentioned by Eusebius. Travellers are too ready to ascribe everything in the way of ruin to the fury of Cambyses and the pious rage of the early Christians. Nothing, however, is easier than to distinguish between the damage done to the monuments by the hand of man and the damage caused by subterraneous upheaval. Mutilation is the rule in one case, displacement in the other. At Dendera, for example, the injury done is wholly wilful. At Abu Simbel it is wholly accidental. At Karnak it is both wilful and accidental. As for Kalebsha, it is clear that no such tremendous havoc could have been effected by human means, without the aid of powerful rams, fire, or gunpowder, any of which must have left unmistakable traces. At Taffa there are two little temples, one in picturesque ruin, one quite perfect, and now used as a stable. There are also a number of stone foundations, separate, quadrangular, subdivided into numerous small chambers, and enclosed in boundary walls, some of which are built on the concave courses just named. These substructures, of which the painter counted 18, have long been the puzzle of travellers. Chapter 19. Back Through Nubia, Part 3. Taffa is charmingly placed, and the 7 miles which divide it from Kalebsha, once no doubt the scene of a cataract, are perhaps the most picturesque on this side of Wadi Halfa. Rocky islets in the river, palm groves, acacias, carobs, henna and castorberry bushes, and all kinds of flowering shrubs, along the edges of the banks, fantastic precipices riven and pinnacled, here rising abruptly from the water's edge, and there from the sandy plain, make lovely sketches whichever way one turns. There are gazelles, it is said, in the ravines behind Taffa, and one of the natives, a truculent fellow in a ragged shirt and dirty white turban, tells how, at a distance of 3 hours up a certain glen, there is another berba larger than either of these in the plain, and a great standing statue taller than 3 men. Here, then, if the tale be true, is another ready-made discovery for whoever may care to undertake it. This same native, having sold a necklace to the idle man and gone away content with his bargain, comes back by and by with half the village at his heels, requiring double price. This modest demand being refused, he rages up and down like a maniac, tears off his turban, goes through a wild manual exercise with his spear, then sits down in stately silence with his friends and neighbours drawn up in a semicircle behind him. This, it seems, is Nubian for a challenge. He has thrown down his gauntlet in form, and demands trial by combat. The noisy crowd, meanwhile, increases every moment. Rais Hassan looks grave, fearing a possible fracas, and the idle man, who is reading the morning service down below, for it is on a Sunday morning, can scarcely be heard for the clamour outside. In this emergency it occurs to the writer to send a message ashore informing these gentlemen that the Hawajis are holding a mosque in the dahabeah, and entreating them to be quiet till the hour of prayer is past. The effect of the message, strange to say, is instantaneous. The angry voices are at once hushed. The challenger puts on his turban. The assembled spectators squat in respectful silence on the bank. A whole hour goes by thus, giving the storm time to blow over, and when the idle man reappears on deck, his would-be adversary comes forward quite pleasantly to discuss the purchase afresh. It matters little how the affair ended, but I believe he was offered his necklace back in exchange for the money paid, and preferred to abide by his bargain. It is as evidence of the sincerity of the religious sentiment in the minds of a semi-savage people that I have thought the incident worth telling. We are now less than 40 miles from Philae, but the head wind is always against us, and the men's bread is exhausted, and there is no flour to be bought in these Nubian villages. The poor fellows swept out the last crumbs from the bottom of their bread chest 3 or 4 days ago, and are now living on quarter rations of lentil soup and a few dried dates bought at Wadi Halfa. Patient and depressed, they crouch silently beside their oars, or forget their hunger in sleep. For ourselves it is painful to witness their need, and still more painful to be unable to help them. Ptolemy, whose own stores are at a low ebb, vows he can do nothing. It would take his few remaining tins of preserved meat to feed 15 men for 2 days, and of flour he has barely enough for the Hawajis. Hungry, well, yes, no doubt they are hungry, but what of that? They are Arabs, and Arabs bear hunger as camels bear thirst. It is nothing new to them. They have often been hungry before. They will often be hungry again. Enough! It is not for the ladies to trouble themselves about such fellows as these. Excellent advice, no doubt, but hard to follow. Not to be troubled, and not to do what little we can do for the poor lads, is impossible. When that little means laying violent hands on Ptolemy's reserve of eggs and biscuits, and getting up lotteries for prizes of chocolate and tobacco, that worthy evidently considers that we have taken leave of our wits. Under a burning sky we touch for an hour or two at Gertesi, and then push on for Dabud. The limestone quarries at Gertasi are full of votive sculptures and inscriptions, and the little ruin, a mere cluster of graceful columns supporting a fragment of cornice, stands high on the brink of a cliff overhanging the river. Take it as you will, from above or below, looking north or looking south, it makes a charming sketch. If transported to Dabud on that magic carpet of the fairy tale, one would take it for a ruin on the beached margin of some placid lake in dreamland. It lies between 2 bends of the river, which here flows wide, showing no outlet and seeming to be girdled by mountains and palm groves. The temple is small and uninteresting, begun like Dhaka by an Ethiopian king and finished by Ptolemies and Caesars. The one curious thing about it is a secret cell, most cunningly devised. Adjoining the sanctuary is a dark side chamber. In the floor of the side chamber is a pit, once paved over. In one corner of the pit is a manhole opening into a narrow passage, and in the narrow passage are steps leading up to a secret chamber constructed in the thickness of the wall. We saw other secret chambers in other temples, but not one in which the old approaches were so perfectly preserved. From Dabad to Philae is but 10 miles, and we are bound for Torigur, which is 2 miles nearer. Now Torigur is that same village at the foot of the beautiful sand-drift near which we moored on our way up the river, and here we are to stay 2 days, followed by at least a week at Philae. No sooner, therefore, have we reached Torigur than Rais Hassan and 3 sailors start for Aswan to buy flour. Old Ali, Rizq Ali, and Musa, whose homes lie in the villages round about, get leave of absence for a week, and we find ourselves reduced all at once to a crew of 5, with only Khalifa in command. 5, however, are as good as 50 when the dahabeah lies moored and there is nothing to do, and our 5, having succeeded in buying some flabby Nubian cakes and green lentils, are now quite happy. So the painter sketches the ruined convent opposite, and L and the little lady write no end of letters, and the idle man with Mehemet Ali for a retriever shoots quail, and everybody is satisfied. Hapless idle man! Hapless but homicidal, if he had been content to shoot only quail, and had not taken to shooting babies. What possessed him to do it? Not, let us hope, an ill-directed ambition, foiled of crocodiles. He went serene and smiling, with his gun under his arm, and Mehemet Ali in his wake. Who so light of heart as that idle man? Who so light of heel as that turbaned retriever? We heard our sportsman popping away presently in the barley. It was a pleasant sound, for we knew his aim was true. Every shot, said we, means a bird. We little dreamed that one of those shots meant a baby. All at once a woman screamed. It was a sharp, sudden scream, following a shot, a scream with a ring of horror in it. Instantly it was caught up from point to point, growing in volume and seeming to be echoed from every direction at once. At the same moment the bank became alive with human beings. They seemed to spring from the soil, women shrieking and waving their arms, men running, all making for the same goal. The writer heard the scream, saw the rush, and knew at once that a gun accident had happened. A few minutes of painful suspense followed. Then Mehemet Ali appeared, tearing back at the top of his speed, and presently, perhaps 5 minutes later, though it seemed like 20, came the idle man, walking very slowly and defiantly, with his head up, his arms folded, his gun gone, and an immense rabble at his heels. Our scanty crew, armed with sticks, flew at once to the rescue, and brought him off in safety. We then learned what had happened. A flight of quail had risen, and as quail fly low, skimming the surface of the grain and diving down again almost immediately, he had taken level aim. At the instant that he fired, and in the very path of the quail, a woman and child who had been squatting in the barley sprang up screaming. He at once saw the coming danger, and with admirable presence of mind, drew the charge of his second barrel. He then hid his cartridge-box and hugged his gun, determined to hold it as long as possible. The next moment he was surrounded, overpowered, had the gun wrenched from his grasp, and received a blow on the back with a stone. Having captured the gun, 1 or 2 of the men let go. It was then that he shook off the rest, and came back to the boat. Mehemet Ali at the same time flew to call a rescue. He too came in for some hard knocks, besides having his shirt rent and his turban torn off his head. Here were we, meanwhile, with less than half our crew, a private war on our hands, no captain, and one of our 3 guns in the hands of the enemy. What a scene it was! A whole village, apparently a very considerable village, swarming on the bank, all hurrying to and fro, all raving, shouting, gesticulating. If we had been on the verge of a fracas at Taffa, here we were threatened with a siege. Drawing in the plank between the boat and the shore, we held a hasty council of war. The woman being unhurt, and the child, if hurt at all, hurt very slightly, we felt justified in assuming an injured tone, calling the village to account for a case of cowardly assault, and demanding instant restitution of the gun. We accordingly sent Ptolemy to parley with the head man of the place, and peremptorily demand the gun. We also bade him add, and this we regarded as a master-stroke of policy, that if due submission was immediately made, the Hawaji, one of whom was a hakim, would permit the father to bring his child on board, and have its hurts attended to. Outwardly indifferent, inwardly not a little anxious, we waited the event. Ptolemy's back being towards the river, we had the whole semicircle of swarthy faces full in view, bent brows, flashing eyes, glittering teeth, all anger, all scorn, all defiance. Suddenly the expression of the faces changed, the change beginning with those nearest the speaker, and spreading gradually outwards. It was as if a wave had passed over them. We knew then that our coup was made. Ptolemy returned. The villagers crowded round their leaders, deliberating. Numbers now began to sit down, and when a Nubian sits down, you may be sure that he is no longer dangerous. Presently, after perhaps a quarter of an hour, the gun was brought back uninjured, and an elderly man carrying a blue bundle appeared on the bank. The plank was now put across, the crowd was kept off, and the man with the bundle and 3 or 4 others were allowed to pass. The bundle being undone, a little brown imp of about 4 years of age, with a shaven head and shaggy scalp lock, was produced. He whimpered at first, seeing the strange white faces, but when offered a fig, forgot his terrors and sat munching it like a monkey. As for his wounds, they were literally skin deep, the shot having but slightly grazed his shoulders in 4 or 5 places. The idle man, however, solemnly sponged the scratches with warm water, and L. covered them with patches of sticking plaster. Finally, the father was presented with a Napoleon, the patient was wrapped in one of his murderer's shirts, and the first act of the tragedy ended. The second and third acts were to come. When the painter and the idle man talked the affair over, they agreed that it was expedient, for the protection of future travellers, to lodge a complaint against the village, and this mainly on account of the treacherous blow dealt from behind, at a time when the idle man, who had not once attempted to defend himself, was powerless in the hands of a mob. They therefore went next day to Aswan, and the governor, charming as ever, promised that justice should be done. Meanwhile we moved the dahabeah to Philae, and there settled down for a week's sketching. Next evening came a woeful deputation from Torriger, entreating forgiveness and stating that 15 villagers had been swept off to prison. The idle man explained that he no longer had anything to do with it, that the matter, in short, was in the hands of justice, and would be dealt with according to law. Hereupon the spokesman gathered up a handful of imaginary dust, and made believe to scatter it on his head. "O dragoman," he said, "tell the Hawaji that there is no law but his pleasure, and no justice but the will of the governor." Summoned next morning to give evidence, the idle man went betimes to Aswan, where he was received in private by the governor and Mutter. Pipes and coffee were handed, and the usual civilities exchanged. The governor then informed his guest that 15 men of Torriger had been arrested, and that 14 of them unanimously identified the 15th as the one who struck the blow. "And now," said the governor, "before we send for the prisoners, it will be as well to decide on the sentence. What does His Excellency wish done to them?" The idle man was puzzled. How could he offer an opinion, being ignorant of the Egyptian civil code? And how could the sentence be decided upon before the trial? The governor smiled serenely. "But," he said, "this is the trial." Being an Englishman, it necessarily cost the idle man an effort to realize the full force of this explanation, an explanation which, in its sublime simplicity, epitomized the whole system of the judicial administration of Egyptian law. He hastened, however, to explain that he cherished no resentment against the culprit or the villagers, and that his only wish was to frighten them into a due respect for travellers in general. The governor hereupon invited the Mutter to suggest a sentence, and the Mutter, taking into consideration, as he said, His Excellency's lenient disposition, proposed to award to the 14 innocent men 1 month's imprisonment each, and to the real offender 2 months' imprisonment, with 150 blows of the bastinado. Shocked at the mere idea of such a sentence, the idle man declared that he must have the innocent set at liberty, but consented that the culprit, for the sake of example, should be sentenced to the 150 blows, the punishment to be remitted after the first few strokes had been dealt. Word was now given for the prisoners to be brought in. The jailer marched first, followed by 2 soldiers. Then came the 15 prisoners, I am ashamed to write it, chained neck to neck in single file. One can imagine how the idle man felt at this moment. Sentence being pronounced, the 14 looked as if they could hardly believe their ears, while the 15th, though condemned to 150 strokes, 75 to each foot, specified the governor, was overjoyed to be let off so easily. He was then flung down, his feet were fastened soles uppermost, and 2 soldiers proceeded to execute the sentence. As each blow fell, he cried, "God save the governor! God save the Mutter! God save the Hawaji!" When the 6th stroke had been dealt, the idle man turned to the governor and formally interceded for the remission of the rest of the sentence. The governor, as formally, granted the request, and the prisoners, weeping for joy, were set at liberty. The governor, the mutter, and the idle man then parted with a profusion of compliments, the governor protesting that his only wish was to be agreeable to the English, and that the whole village should have been bastinadoed, had his Excellency desired it. We spent 8 enchanting days at Philae, and it so happened, when the afternoon of the 8th came round, that for the last few hours the writer was alone on the island. Alone, that is to say, with only a sailor in attendance, which was virtual solitude, and Philae is a place to which solitude adds an inexpressible touch of pathos and remoteness. It has been a hot day, and there is dead calm on the river. My last sketch finished, I wander slowly round from spot to spot, saying farewell to Pharaoh's bed, to the painted columns, to every terrace and palm and shrine and familiar point of view. I peep once again into the mystic chamber of Osiris. I see the sunset for the last time from the roof of the temple of Isis. Then, when all that wondrous flush of rose and gold has died away, comes the warm afterglow. No words can paint the melancholy beauty of Philae at this hour. The surrounding mountains stand out jagged and purple against a pale amber sky. The Nile is glassy. Not a breath, not a bubble, troubles the inverted landscape. Every palm is twofold, every stone is doubled. The big boulders in mid-stream are reflected so perfectly that it is impossible to tell where the rock ends and the water begins. The temples, meanwhile, have turned to a subdued golden bronze, and the pylons are peopled with shapes that glow with fantastic life, and look ready to step down from their places. The solitude is perfect, and there is a magical stillness in the air. I hear a mother crooning to her baby on the neighboring island, a sparrow twittering in its little nest in the capital of a column below my feet, a vulture screaming plaintively among the rocks in the far distance. I look, I listen, I promise myself that I will remember it all in years to come, all the solemn hills, these silent colonnades, these deep, quiet spaces of shadow, these sleeping palms. Lingering till it is all but dark, I at last bid them farewell, fearing lest I may behold them no more. Chapter 20. Silsilis and Edfu, Part 1. Going, it cost us 4 days to struggle up from Aswan to Mahada. Returning, we slid down, thanks to our old friend the Sheikh of the Cataract, in one short, sensational half-hour. He came, flat-faced, fishy-eyed, fatuous as ever, with his head tied up in the same old yellow handkerchief, and with the same chibouque in his mouth. He brought with him a following of 50 stalwart Shelalis, and under his arm he carried a tattered red flag. This flag, on which were embroidered the crescent and star, he hoisted with much solemnity at the prow. Consigned thus to the protection of the Prophet, windows and tambushi shuttered, doors closed, breakables removed to a place of safety, and everything made snug as if for a storm at sea, we put off from Mahada at 7 a.m. on a lovely morning in the middle of March. The Philae, instead of threading her way back through the old channels, strikes across to the Libyan side, making straight for the Big Bab, that formidable rapid which as yet we have not seen. All last night we heard its voice in the distance. Now, at every stroke of the oars, that rushing sound draws nearer. The Sheikh of the Cataract is our captain, and his men are our sailors today. Rais Hassan and the crew having only to sit still and look on. The Shelalis, meanwhile, row swiftly and steadily. Already the river seems to be running faster than usual. Already the current feels stronger under our keel. And now suddenly there is sparkle and foam on the surface yonder. There are rocks ahead. Rocks to the right and left. Eddies everywhere. The Sheikh lays down his pipe, kicks off his shoes, and goes himself to the prow. His second in command is stationed at the top of the stairs leading to the upper deck. 6 men take the tiller. The rowers are reinforced, and sit 2 to each side. In the midst of these preparations, when everybody looks grave, and even the Arabs are silent, we all at once find ourselves at the mouth of a long and narrow strait, a kind of ravine between two walls of rock, through which at a steep incline there rushes a roaring mass of waters. The whole Nile, in fact, seems to be thundering in wild waves down that terrible channel. It seems, at first sight, impossible that any dahabeah should venture that way and not be dashed to pieces. The sheikh, however, gives the word, his second echoes it, the men at the helm obey. They put the dahabeah straight at that monster mill race. For one breathless second we seem to tremble on the edge of the fall. Then the Philae plunges in headlong. We see the whole boat slope down bodily under our feet. We feel the leap, the dead fall, the staggering rush forward. Instantly the waves are foaming and boiling up on deck with spray. The men ship their oars, leaving all to helm and current, and despite the hoarse tumult, we distinctly hear those oars scrape the rocks on either side. Now the sheikh, looking for the moment quite majestic, stands motionless with uplifted arm, for at the end of this pass there is a sharp turn to the right, as sharp as a street corner in a narrow London thoroughfare. Can the Philae, measuring 100 feet from stem to stern, ever round that angle in safety? Suddenly the uplifted arm is waved. The sheikh thunders, "Dafit!" helm. The men, steady and prompt, put the helm about. The boat, answering splendidly to the word of command, begins to turn before we are out of the rocks. Then, shooting round the corner at exactly the right moment, comes out safe and sound with only an oar broken. Great is the rejoicing. Rais Hassan, in the joy of his heart, runs to shake hands all around. The Arabs burst into a chorus of taibs and salames, and Ptolemy, coming up all smiles, is set upon by half a dozen playful Shelalis, who snatch his keffiyeh from his head and carry it off as a trophy. The only one unmoved is the Sheikh of the Cataract. His momentary flash of energy over, he slouches back with the old stolid face, slips on his shoes, drops on his heels, lights his pipe, and looks more like an owl than ever. We had fancied till now that the Cataract Arabs for their own profit, and travellers for their own glory, had grossly exaggerated the dangers of the Big Bab. But such is not the case. The Big Bab is in truth a serious undertaking, so serious that I doubt whether any English boatman would venture to take such a boat down such a rapid, and between such rocks, as the Shelali Arabs took the Philae that day. All dahabeahs, however, are not so lucky. Of 34 that shot the fall this season, several had been slightly damaged, and one was so disabled that she had to lie up at Aswan for a fortnight to be mended. Of actual shipwreck, or injury to life and limb, I do not suppose there is any real danger. The Shelalis are wonderfully cool and skilful, and have abundant practice. Our painter, it is true, preferred rolling up his canvases and carrying them round on dry land by way of the desert, but this was a precaution that neither he nor any of us would have dreamed of taking on account of our own personal safety. There is, in fact, little, if anything, to fear, and the traveller who forgoes the descent of the cataract forgoes a very curious sight and a very exciting adventure. At Aswan we bade farewell to Nubia and the blameless Ethiopians, and found ourselves once more traversing the Nile of Egypt. If instead of 5 miles of cataract we had crossed 500 miles of sea or desert, the change could not have been more complete. We left behind us a dreamy river, a silent shore, an ever-present desert. Returning, we plunged back at once into the midst of a fertile and populous region. All day long, now, we see boats on the river, villages on the banks, birds on the wing, husbandmen on the land, men and women, horses, camels, and asses, passing perpetually to and fro on the towing path. There is always something moving, something doing. The Nile is running low, and the shadoofs, 3 deep now, are in full swing from morning till night. Again the smoke goes up from clusters of unseen huts at close of day. Again we hear the dogs barking from hamlet to hamlet in the still hours of the night. Again, towards sunset, we see troops of girls coming down to the riverside with their water jars on their heads. Those Arab maidens, when they stand with garments tightly tucked up and just their feet in the water, dripping the gula at arm's length in the fresher gush of the current, almost tempt one's pencil into the forbidden paths of caricature. Kom Ombo is a magnificent torso. It was once as large as Dendera, perhaps larger, for, being on the same grand scale, it was a double temple and dedicated to two gods, Horus and Sebek, the hawk and the crocodile. Now there remain only a few giant columns buried to within 8 or 10 feet of their gorgeous capitals, a superb fragment of architrave, one broken wave of sculptured cornice, and some fallen blocks graven with the names of Ptolemies and Cleopatras. A great double doorway, a hall of columns, and a double sanctuary are said to be yet perfect, though no longer accessible. The roofing blocks of 3 halls, one behind the other, and a few capitals, are yet visible behind the portico. What more may lie buried below the surface none can tell. We only know that an ancient city and a medieval hamlet have been slowly engulfed, and that an early temple, contemporary with the temple of Amada, once stood within the sacred enclosure. The sand here has been accumulating for 2,000 years. It lies 40 feet deep, and has never been excavated. It will never be excavated now, for the Nile is gradually sapping the bank, and carrying away piecemeal from below what the desert has buried from above. Half of one noble pylon, a cataract of sculptured blocks, strews the steep slope from top to bottom. The other half hangs suspended on the brink of the precipice. It cannot hang so much longer. A day must soon come when it will collapse with a crash, and thunder down like its fellow. Between Kom Ombo and Silsilis we lost our painter. Not that he either strayed or was stolen, but that, having accomplished the main object of his journey, he was glad to seize the first opportunity of getting back quickly to Cairo. That opportunity, represented by a noble duke honeymooning with a steam tug, happened halfway between Kom Ombo and Silsilis. Painter and duke being acquaintances of old, the matter was soon settled. In less than a quarter of an hour, the big picture and all the paraphernalia of the studio were transported from the stern cabin of the Philae to the stern cabin of the steam tug, and our painter, fitted out with an extempore canteen, a cook-boy, a waiter, and his fair share of the necessities of life, was soon disappearing gaily in the distance at the rate of 20 miles an hour. If the happy couple, so weary of wind-heads, so satiated with temples, followed that vanishing steam-tug with eyes of melancholy longing, the writer at least asked nothing better than to drift on with the Philae. Still, the Nile is long and life is short, and the tale told by our log-book was certainly not encouraging. When we reached Silsilis on the morning of the 17th of March, the north wind had been blowing with only 1 day's intermission since the 1st of February. At Silsilis one looks in vain for traces of that great barrier which once blocked the Nile at this point. The stream is narrow here, and the sandstone cliffs come down on both sides to the water's edge. In some places there is space for a footpath, in others none. There are also some sunken rocks in the bed of the river, upon one of which, by the way, a Cook steamer had struck 2 days before, but of such a mass as could have dammed the Nile, and by its disruption not only have caused the river to desert its bed at Philae, but have changed the whole physical and climatic conditions of Lower Nubia, there is no sign whatever. The Arabs here show a rock fantastically quarried in the shape of a gigantic umbrella, to which they pretend some king of old attached one end of a chain with which he barred the Nile. It may be that in this apocryphal legend there survives some memory of the ancient barrier. The cliffs of the western bank are rich in memorial niches, votive shrines, tombs, historical stela, and inscriptions. These last date from the 6th to the 22nd dynasties. Some of the tombs and alcoves are very curious, ranged side by side in a long row close above the river, and revealing glimpses of seated figures and gaudy decorations within. They look like private boxes with their occupants. In many of these we found mutilated triads of gods, sculptured and painted, and in one larger than the rest were 3 niches, each containing 3 deities. Chapter 20. Silsilis and Edfu, Part 2. The great speos of Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, lies farthest north, and the memorial shrines of the Ramesses family lie farthest south of the series. The first is a long gallery, like a cloister supported on 4 square columns, and is excavated parallel with the river. The walls, inside and out, are covered with delicately executed sculptures in low relief, some of which yet retain traces of color. The triumph of Horemheb returning from conquest in the land of Cush, and the famous subject on the south wall described by Mariette as one of the few really lovely things in Egyptian art, have been too often engraved to need description. The votive shrines of the Ramesses family are grouped all together in a picturesque nook, green with bushes to the water's edge. There are 3, the work of Seti I, Ramesses II, and Meneptah, lovely alcoves, each like a little proscenium, with painted cornices and side pillars, and groups of kings and gods still bright with color. In most of the votive sculptures of Silsilis, there figure 2 deities but rarely seen elsewhere, namely Sebek, the crocodile god, and Hapimu, the lotus-crowned god of the Nile. This last was the tutelary deity of the spot, and was worshipped at Silsilis with special rites. Hymns in his honor are found carved here and there upon the rocks. Most curious of all, however, is a goddess named Ta-Arit, represented in one of the side subjects of the shrine of Ramesses II. This charming person, who has the body of a hippopotamus and the face of a woman, wears a tie wig and a robe of state with 5 capes, and looks like a cross between a Lord Chancellor and a coachman. Behind her stand Thoth and Nut, all 3 receiving the homage of Queen Nefertari, who advances with an offering of 2 sistrums. As a hippopotamus crowned with the disk and plumes, we had met with this goddess before. She is not uncommon as an amulet, and the writer had already sketched her at Philae, where she occupies a prominent place in the facade of the Mamisi. But the grotesque elegance of her attire at Silsilis is, I imagine, quite unique. The interest of the western bank centres in its sculptures and inscriptions, the interest of the eastern bank in its quarries. We rode over to a point nearly opposite the shrines of the Ramessides, and climbing a steep verge of debris, came to the mouth of a narrow cutting, between walls of solid rock, from 40 to 50 feet in height. These walls are smooth, clean-cut, and faultlessly perpendicular. The color of the sandstone is rich amber. The passage is about 10 feet in width and perhaps 400 feet in length. Seen at a little after midday, with one side in shadow, the other in sunlight, and a narrow ribbon of blue sky overhead, it is like nothing else in the world, unless, perhaps, the entrance to Petra. Following this passage, we came presently to an immense area, at least as large as Belgrave Square, beyond which, separated by a thin partition of rock, opened a second and somewhat smaller area. On the walls of these huge amphitheatres the chisel marks and wedge holes were as fresh as if the last blocks had been taken hence but yesterday, yet it is some 2,000 years since the place last rang to the blows of the mallet, and echoed back the voices of the workmen. From the days of the Theban pharaohs to the days of the Ptolemies and Caesars, those echoes can never have been silent. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, of Gurna, of Medinet Habu, of Esna and Edfu and Hermonthis, all came from here, and from the quarries on the opposite side of the river. Returning, we climbed long hills of chips, looked down into valleys of debris, and came at last to the riverside by way of an ancient inclined plane, along which the blocks were slid down to the transport boats below. But the most wonderful thing about Silsilis is the way in which the quarrying has been done. In all these halls and passages and amphitheatres the sandstone has been sliced out smooth and straight, like hay from a hayrick. Everywhere the blocks have been taken out square, and everywhere the best of the stone has been extracted, and the worst left. When it was fine in grain and even in colour, it has been cut out with the nicest economy. Where it was whitish or brownish or traversed by veins of violet, it has been left standing. Here and there we saw places where the lower part had been removed and the upper part left projecting, like the overhanging stories of our old medieval timber houses. Compared with this puissant and perfect quarrying, our rough and ready blasting looks like the work of savages. Struggling hard against the wind, we left Silsilis that same afternoon. The wrecked steamer was now more than half under water. She had broken her back and begun filling immediately, with all Cook's party on board. Being rowed ashore with what necessaries they could gather together, these unfortunates had been obliged to encamp in tents borrowed from the mutter of the district. Luckily for them, a couple of homeward-bound dahabeahs came by next morning, and took off as many as they could accommodate. The Duke's steam-tug received the rest. The tents were still there, and a gang of natives under the superintendence of the mutter were busy getting off all that could be saved from the wreck. As evening drew on, our head wind became a hurricane, and that hurricane lasted day and night for 36 hours. All this time the Nile was driving up against the current in great rollers, like rollers on the Cornish coast when the tide and wind set together from the west. To hear them roaring past in the darkness of the night, to feel the Philae rocking, shivering, straining at her mooring ropes, and bumping perpetually against the bank, was far from pleasant. By day the scene was extraordinary. There were no clouds, but the air was thick with sand, through which the sun glimmered feebly. Some palms, looking grey and ghost-like on the bank above, bent as if they must break before the blast. The Nile was yeasty, and flecked with brown foam, large lumps of which came swirling every now and then against our cabin windows. The opposite bank was simply nowhere. Judging only by what was visible from the deck, one would have vowed that the dahabeah was moored against an open coast, with an angry sea coming in. The wind fell about 5 a.m. the second day, when the men at once took to their oars, and by breakfast time brought us to Edfu. Nothing now could be more delicious than the weather. It was a cool, silvery, misty morning, such a morning as one never knows in Nubia, where the sun is no sooner up than one is plunged at once into the full blaze and stress of the day. There were donkeys waiting for us on the bank, and our way lay for about a mile through barley flats and cotton plantations. The country looked rich, the people smiling and well-conditioned. We met a troop of them going down to the dahabeah with sheep, pigeons, poultry, and a young ox for sale. Crossing a backwater bridged by a few rickety palm trunks, we now approached the village, which is perched, as usual, on the mounds of the ancient city. Meanwhile the great pylons, seeming to grow larger every moment, rose creamy and light against a soft blue sky. Riding through lanes of huts, we came presently to an open space and a long flight of roughly built steps in front of the temple. At the top of these steps we were standing on the level of the modern village. At the bottom we saw the massive pavement that marked the level of the ancient city. From that level rose the pylons, which even from afar off had looked so large. We now found that those stupendous towers not only soared to a height of about 75 feet above our heads, but plunged down to a depth of at least 40 more beneath our feet. 10 years ago nothing was visible of the great temple of Edfu save the tops of these pylons. The rest of the building was as much lost to sight as if the earth had opened up and swallowed it. Its courtyards were choked with foul debris. Its sculptured chambers were buried under 40 feet of soil. Its terraced roof was a maze of closely packed huts, swarming with human beings, poultry, dogs, kine, asses, and vermin. Thanks to the indefatigable energy of Mariette, these Aegean stables were cleansed some 30 years ago. Writing himself of this tremendous task, he says, "I caused to be demolished the 64 houses which encumbered the roof, as well as 28 more which approach too near the outer wall of the temple. When the whole shall be isolated from its present surroundings by a massive wall, the work of restoration at Edfu will be accomplished." That wall has not yet been built, but the encroaching mound has been cut clean away all around the building, now standing free in a deep open space, the sides of which are in some places as perpendicular as the quarried cliffs of Silsilis. In the midst of this pit, like a risen god issuing from the grave, The huge building stands before us in the sunshine, erect and perfect. The effect at first sight is overwhelming. Through the great doorway, 50 feet in height, we catch glimpses of a grand courtyard, and of a vista of doorways, one behind another. Going slowly down, we see farther into those dark and distant halls at every step. At the same time the pylons, covered with gigantic sculptures, tower higher and higher, and seem to shut out the sky. The custode, a pygmy of 6'2", in semi-European dress, looks up grinning, expectant of baksheesh. For there is actually a custode here, and which is more to the purpose, a good strong gate, through which neither pilfering visitors nor pilfering Arabs can pass unnoticed. Who enters that gate crosses the threshold of the past, and leaves 2,000 years behind him. In these vast courts and storied halls all is unchanged. Every pavement, every column, every stair is in its place. The roof, but for a few roofing stones missing, just over the sanctuary, is not only uninjured but in good repair. The hieroglyphic inscriptions are as sharp and legible as the day they were cut. If here and there a capital, or the face of a human-headed deity has been mutilated, these are blemishes which at first one scarcely observes, and which in no wise mar the wonderful effect of the whole. We cross that great courtyard in the full blaze of the morning sunlight. In the colonnades on either side there is shade, and in the pillared portico beyond, a darkness as of night, save where a patch of deep blue sky burns through a square opening in the roof, and is matched by a corresponding patch of blinding light on the pavement below. Hence we pass on through a hall of columns, 2 transverse corridors, a side chapel, a series of pitch-dark side chambers, and a sanctuary. Outside all these, surrounding the actual temple on 3 sides, runs an external corridor open to the sky, and bounded by a superb wall full 40 feet in height. When I have said that the entrance front, with its twin pylons and central doorway, measures 250 feet in width by 125 feet in height, that the first courtyard measures more than 160 feet in length by 140 in width, that the entire length of the building is 450 feet, and that it covers an area of 80,000 square feet, I have stated facts of a kind which convey no more than a general idea of largeness to the ordinary reader, of the harmony of the proportions, of the amazing size and strength of the individual parts, of the perfect workmanship, of the fine grain and creamy amber of the stone. No description can do more than suggest an indefinite notion. Chapter 20. Silsilis and Edfu, Part 3. Edfu and Dendera may almost be called twin temples. They belong to the same period. They are built very nearly after the same plan. They are even allied in a religious sense, for the myths of Horus and Hathor are interdependent, the one being the complement of the other. Thus, in the inscriptions of Edfu we find perpetual allusion to the cultus of Dendera, and vice versa. Both Edfu and Dendera are rich in descriptions, but as the extent of wall space is greater at Edfu, so is the literary wealth of this temple greater than the literary wealth of Dendera. Every wall, every ceiling, every pillar, every architrave, every passage and side chamber, however dark, every staircase, every doorway, the outer wall of the temple, the inner side of the great wall of circuit, the huge pylons from top to bottom, are not only covered but crowded with figures and hieroglyphs. Among these we find no enormous battle subjects as at Abu Simbel, no heroic recitals like the poem of Pentar. Those went out with the pharaohs, and were succeeded by tableaux of religious rites and dialogues of gods and kings. Such are the stock subjects of Ptolemaic edifices. They abound at Dendera and Esna as well as at Edfu. But at Edfu there are more inscriptions of a miscellaneous character than in any temple of Egypt, and it is precisely this secular information which is so priceless. Here are geographical lists of Nubian and Egyptian nomes, with their principal cities, their products, and their tutelary gods, lists of tributary provinces and princes, lists of temples, and of the lands pertaining thereunto, lists of canals, of ports, of lakes, calendars of feasts and fasts, astronomical tables, genealogies and chronicles of the gods, lists of the priests and priestesses of both Edfu and Dendera, with their names, lists also of singers and assistant functionaries, lists of offerings, hymns, invocations, and such a profusion of religious legends as make the walls of Edfu alone a complete textbook of Egyptian mythology. No great collection of these inscriptions, like the Dendera of Mariette, has yet been published. But every now and then some enterprising Egyptologist, such as M. Naville or M. Jacques de Rouget, plunges for a while into the depths of the Edfu mine and brings back as much precious ore as he can carry. Some most singular and interesting details have thus been brought to light. One inscription, for instance, records exactly in what month, and on what day, and at what hour, Isis gave birth to Horus. Another tells us about the sacred boats. We know that Edfu possessed at least two, and that one was called Horhat, or the first Horus, and the other Mafek, or Great of Turquoise. These boats, it would appear, were not merely for carrying in procession, but for actual use upon the water. Another text, one of the most curious, informs us that Hathor of Dendera paid an annual visit to Horus, or Horhat, of Edfu, and spent some days with him in his temple. The whole ceremonial of this fantastic trip is given in detail. The goddess travelled in her boat called Neb Mertet, or Lady of the Lake. Horus, like a polite host, went out in his boat Horhat to meet her. The two deities with their attendants then formed one procession and so came to Edfu, where the goddess was entertained with a succession of festivals. One would like to know whether Horus duly returned all these visits, and if the gods, like modern emperors, had a gay time among themselves. Other questions inevitably suggest themselves, sometimes painfully, sometimes ludicrously, as one paces chamber after chamber, corridor after corridor, sculptured all over with strange forms and stranger legends. What about these gods whose genealogies are so intricate, whose mutual relations are so complicated, who wedded and became parents, who exchanged visits, and who even travelled at times to distant countries? What about those who served them in the temples, who robed and unrobed them, who celebrated their birthdays and paraded them in stately processions, and consumed the lives of millions in erecting these mountains of masonry and sculpture to their honour? We know now with what elaborate rites the gods were adored, what jewels they wore, what hymns were sung in their praise. We know from what a subtle and philosophical core of solar myths their curious personal adventures were evolved. We may also be quite sure that the hidden meaning of these legends was almost wholly lost sight of in the later days of the religion, and that the gods were accepted for what they seemed to be, and not for what they symbolized. What then of their worshippers? Did they really believe all these things, or were there any among them tormented with doubts of the gods? Were there skeptics in those days, who wondered how two hierogrammates could look each other in the face without laughing? The custode told us that there were 242 steps to the top of each tower of the propylon. We counted 224, and dispensed willingly with the remainder. It was a long pull, but had the steps been 4 times as many, the sight from the top would have been worth the climb. The chambers in the pylons are on a grand scale, with wide beveled windows like the mouths of monster letterboxes, placed at regular intervals all the way up. Through these windows the great flagstaffs and pennons were regulated from within. The 2 pylons communicate by a terrace over the central doorway. The parapet of this terrace and the parapets of the pylons above are plentifully scrawled with names, many of which were left there by the French soldiers of 1799. The cornices of these 2 magnificent towers are unfortunately gone, but the total height without them is 125 feet. From the top, as from the minaret of the great mosque at Damascus, one looks down into the heart of the town. Hundreds of mud huts, thatched with palm leaves, hundreds of little courtyards, lie mapped out beneath one's feet, and, as the fellow lives in his yard by day, using his hut merely as a sleeping place at night, one looks down, like the Diable Boiteau, upon the domestic doings of a roofless world. We see people moving to and fro, unconscious of strange eyes watching them from above, men lounging, smoking, sleeping in shady corners, children playing, infants crawling on all fours, women cooking at clay ovens in the open air, cows and sheep feeding, poultry scratching and pecking, dogs basking in the sun. The huts look more like the lairs of prairie dogs than the dwellings of human beings. The little mosque with its one dome and stunted minaret, so small, so far below, looks like a clay toy. Beyond the village, which reaches far and wide, lie barley fields and cotton patches and palm groves, bounded on one side by the river and on the other by the desert. A broad road, dotted over with moving specks of men and cattle, cleaves its way straight through the cultivated land and out across the sandy plain beyond. We can trace its course for miles where it is only a trodden track in the desert. It goes, they tell us, direct to Cairo. On the opposite bank glares a hideous white sugar factory, and bowered in greenery a country villa of the Khedive. The broad Nile flows between. The sweet Theban hills gleam through a pearly haze on the horizon. All at once a fitful breeze springs up, blowing in little gusts and swirling the dust in circles round our feet. At the same moment, like a beautiful spectre, there rises from the desert close by an undulating, semi-transparent stalk of yellow sand, which grows higher every moment, and begins moving northward across the plain. Almost at the same instant, another appears a long way off, towards the south, and a third comes gliding mysteriously along the opposite bank. While we are watching the third, the first begins throwing off a wonderful kind of plume, which follows it, waving and melting in the air. And now the stranger from the south comes up at a smooth, tremendous pace, towering at least 500 feet above the desert, till, meeting some cross-current, it is snapped suddenly in twain. The lower half instantly collapses, the upper, after hanging suspended for a moment, spreads and floats slowly like a cloud. In the meanwhile, other and smaller columns form here and there, stalk a little way, waver, disperse, form again, and again drop away in dust. Then the breeze falls and puts an abrupt end to this extraordinary spectacle. In less than 2 minutes there is not a sand column left. As they came, they vanish, suddenly. Such is the landscape that frames the temple, and the temple, after all, is the sight that one comes up here to see. There it lies, far below our feet, the courtyard with its almost perfect pavement, the flat roof, compact of gigantic monoliths, the wall of circuit with its panoramic sculptures, the portico with its screens and pillars distinct in bright light against inner depths of dark, each pillar a shaft of ivory, each square of dark a block of ebony. So perfect, so solid, so splendid is the whole structure, so simple in unity of plan, so complex in ornament, so majestic in completeness, that one feels as if it solved the whole problem of religious architecture. Take it for what it is, a Ptolemaic structure preserved in all its integrity of strength and finish, it is certainly the finest extant temple in Egypt. It brings before us with even more completeness than Dendera the purposes of its various parts, and the kind of ceremonial for which it was designed. Every corridor and chamber tells its own story. Even the names of the different chambers are graven upon them in such wise that nothing would be easier than to reconstruct the ground plan of the whole building in hieroglyphic nomenclature. That neither the Ptolemaic building nor the Ptolemaic mythos can be accepted as strictly representative of either pure Egyptian art or pure Egyptian thought, must of course be conceded. Both are modified by Greek influences, and have so far departed from the Pharaonic model. But then we have no equally perfect specimen of the Pharaonic model. The Ramesseum is but a grand fragment. Karnak and Medinet Habu are aggregates of many temples and many styles. Abydos is still half buried. Amid so much that is fragmentary, amid so much that is ruined, the one absolutely perfect structure, Ptolemaic though it be, is of incalculable interest and equally incalculable value. While we are dreaming over these things, trying to fancy how it all looked when the sacred flotilla came sweeping up the river yonder, and the procession of Horhat issued forth to meet the goddess guest, while we are half expecting to see the whole brilliant concourse pour out, priests in their robes of panther skin, priestesses with the tinkling sistrum, Singers and harpists, and bearers of gifts and emblems, and high functionaries rearing aloft the sacred boat of the god. In this moment a turbaned mueddin comes out upon the rickety wooden gallery of the little minaret below, and intones the call to midday prayer. That plaintive cry has hardly died away before we see men here and there amongst the huts turning towards the east, and assuming the first postures of devotion. The women go on cooking and nursing their babies. I have seen Moslem women at prayer in the mosques of Constantinople, but never in Egypt. Meanwhile, some children catch sight of us, and notwithstanding that we are 125 feet above their heads, burst into a frantic chorus of bakshish. And now, with a last long look at the temple and the wide landscape beyond, we come down again, and go to see a dismal little Mamisi 3 parts buried among a wilderness of mounds close by. These mounds, which consist almost entirely of crude brick débris with embedded fragments of stone and pottery, are built up like coral reefs, and represent the dwellings of some 60 generations. When they are cut straight through, as here round about the great temple, the substance of them looks like rich plum cake.